we're going to get started in about 60 seconds, and I'll let Maheen and Taimur join in. And this is maybe a great chance because I think I know a little bit more about what Maheen might say and what Taimur might say, but I haven't followed the Punjab as closely. And I know you have good news today in terms of some of the revenue numbers. Finance Minister Hashim Bakht. So maybe we'll kick off with a little bit of uh, your own take on how well things are going. I think that's important for politicians to be able to do. And then obviously we'll have some tougher questions as the conversation progresses. So if you just maybe if I could ask you to just start off with, I saw there was some news around revenue, but I'd love for you to break it down for everyone and tell us what the good news is in the Punjab, specifically from a revenue perspective. And then obviously I'll give you a chance to, lay out the public finance reform kind of agenda that you have going under your leadership in the Punjab, Hashim.
Thank you, Mosharraf. So you see, the provinces have traditionally behaved more like treasuries than finance departments in the past. And post the 18th Amendment, they have now the flexibility to actually focus on adding on to their own revenue streams. And this is certainly one of the areas where Punjab has, in fact, wanted to increase its own share of resources so that it can fund its own development program and overall service requirements which we have. So the reliance on the federal over time should decrease. One of the things which got transferred to the provinces was the Punjab Revenue Authority. The revenue authorities, which are basically collecting sales tax on services. So the finer distinction of services and goods, some of the things flow into services and then into goods, but there are certain sectors which are completely service centric. Our last year's budget helped us kind of refocus, reorient ourselves in COVID times. So what we did was we'd say, okay, we always talk about the fact that how about we reduce the base rate from the average, bring it down substantially, and then focus on increasing the size and focus on actually what other avenues of growth there are in terms of increasing the tax base. So on 25 odd services, we reduced our rate from a standard 16% to 5%. So we thought it's it's in COVID times. We need to help businesses come back on their feet. So they should not be the government taxation agencies should not be an impediment to this rebound. Uh, so it actually worked well for us. In fact, this year when I presented the budget, and this we were the only province which did that, and this year we added further 10 services to it because we actually saw a very good response. In various areas, we were able to uh, collect more taxes. We got the tax base more receptive to a lower tax rate. Also, what we worked on was consumer customer behavior. For example, we encouraged customers and taxpayers in Punjab that if they use their credit cards or their debit cards, they will be able to get a lower tax rate in restaurants. So people themselves started promoting a tax culture. For example, if you're sitting in any restaurant, you would say, I want to pay by credit card or debit card. That was a 5% slab versus in cash, that was a 16% slab. So that 11% incentivization was now helping us get more documentation going. So all of this has contributed in Punjab actually posting 144 billion in resources just generated through its sales tax on services, which is Punjab Revenue Authority. It's the highest. Usually, Sindh used to take the lead in these things, but Punjab has really caught up, and our overall growth is 33% this year. So, this has been a great learning. We have continued with our tax concessions for the year, which are over 50 billion. And I think with an improved intelligence, tax intelligence network, in the sense that you have social media, you see how things are operating, where businesses are. You have a more visibility on how to improve your tax net. So we have seen some good promising results here.
Okay, so let's start, Hashim Saab, with the with the reduction in the rate that you mentioned, I believe you brought it down from 16% to 5%. Is that
Correct.
accurate?
Correct.
Just
Yes.
explain to people who are listening, because I think, the ordinary person, myself included, when we hear somebody reducing the tax rate, our assumption is, oh my God, the elite have gotten together again, और ये अब सब मिलके एक दूसरे को ब्रेक्स दे रहे हैं, और ये और जो है गरीब अवाम के साथ ज्यादती हो रही है, और इन्होंने अमीर लोगों को जो है ब्रेक दिया है. So just break down what that actually means and what the net benefit has been to the Punjab as a result of this reduction.
अच्छा, हमारे जो टैक्सेस की नेचर है प्रोविंस के अंदर, इसमें जिस टैक्स की पर्टिकुलरली मैं बात कर रहा हूँ, इसमें कोई बड़े वेस्टेड या ओलिगोपोलीज नहीं है. ये तो लॉन्ड्री वाले, रेस्टोरेंट्स वाले, ब्यूटी पार्लर्स या आपके सर्विसेज सेक्टर के अंदर जो वेडिंग हॉल्स रन करते हैं, इस तरह के द आइडिया केम थ्रू कि कोविड की एसओपीज की वजह से बहुत सारे बिजनेसेस को सफर हो रहा है. जब भी ये वेव्स खत्म होंगी, दे विल रिक्वायर दैट दैट इलास्टिसिटी शुड बी विद देम. तो ये हम इनको कम रेट पे चार्ज करें. मोस्ट ऑफ दिस इज पास ऑन. सो वी वांटेड द इकोनॉमी टू हैव दैट बॉयंसी इन देम. ये करने से एक तो हमने किसी एक सेगमेंट को नहीं दिया, बहुत सारे 20-25 छोटे सेगमेंट्स थे जिसके अंदर ये अक्रॉस द बोर्ड दिया गया. उससे ये हुआ कि देन वी फोकस्ड ऑन कि यार अब ये कर तो रहे हैं हम, बट नाउ इंक्रीज द नंबर ऑफ टैक्स पेयर्स, एक्टिव टैक्स पेयर्स. तो 10,000 टैक्स पेयर हमने इस साल में ऐड किए. और साथ साथ हमारे पंजाब रेवेन्यू अथॉरिटी के अंदर लोगों ने बैठ के बड़ा सिस्टमिकली काम भी किया है, इंटेलिजेंट एआई सिस्टम्स के थ्रू, कि और टैक्स पेयर्स को देखें कहाँ पे हैं जो पहले नेट पे विजिबल नहीं थे. एक बड़े अरसे से टेंडेंसी चलती आ रही है कि कॉमन बिलीफ ये है कि जी इट्स बेटर नॉट टू बी अ टैक्स पेयर देन टू बी इन द नेट. जो नहीं है उसको कोई नहीं पूछ रहा. तो जो नहीं है उसको कोई नहीं पूछ रहा पे बड़ा काम किया गया है. एंड दैट इज व्हाई आई एम सेइंग कि ये एक अच्छा एक्सपीरियंस रहा था, जिस कोविड की वजह से जिस तरह हमने ये प्रो बिजनेस एनवायरनमेंट को, प्रो बिजनेस अप्रोच को आगे लेके चले, तो दिस हैज यील्डेड गुड रिजल्ट्स फॉर अस. एंड अब इसके बाद इस साल भी हम इसी को कंटिन्यू कर रहे हैं. इनफैक्ट 10 मोर सर्विसेज वी हैव एडेड. सो दो तीन, एक तो कोविड रीजन था, एक ये था कि टैक्स बेस में अभी भी गुंजाइश थी बढ़ाने की, फोकस उस पर करें. तीसरा ये था कि ऐसे सेक्टर्स जो अभी एम्ब्रियोनिक स्टेजेस में है, जैसे एग्रीकल्चर सर्विसेज है, अभी इस तरह इस साइड पे चीजें आई नहीं है. तो लेट द सेगमेंट डेवलप फर्स्ट एंड देन वी शुड लुक एट द ओवरऑल डॉक्यूमेंटेशन एंड टैक्सेशन ऑफ इट. इसका रिजल्ट ये है कि आज ये 144 बिलियन को क्रॉस कर रहा है. इसमें 33% इसने ग्रो किया है पिछले साल से. और मुझे उम्मीद है कि with this sort of a buoyancy and the recovery of the economy which we are seeing, ये services sector में भी बेहतरी आएगी, and we should be looking at more reliance on our own source revenue generation.
Fantastic. Hashim, we're delighted to welcome Taimur Jhagra, who has also joined us. Taimur and you are both young and, by all accounts, very bright finance ministers for, perhaps, I mean, certainly Punjab is by far the largest province in the country. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa might be the most important for many reasons, not all of them having to do with finances. We'll also be joined by Maheen, who is the CEO of InfraZamin and former CEO of Al-Falah Investments, and knows quite a bit about capital markets and the private sector end of this equation. So we think we have a great group. Once again, welcome to both of you, and thanks to both of you for joining. Taimur, I've already started. We've already gotten Hashim to tell us a little bit about के पंजाब में revenue growth जो है वो किस तरह ensure कर रहे हैं. And I know you have a great story to tell on that front as well. But I want to stick to the topic that I think merits some exploration. इसमें कुछ मुश्किल सवालात भी हैं, कुछ ऐसे सवालात मुश्किल जो और लोगों ने जो है वो जब हमने अनाउंस किया तो उन्होंने उठाए. तो हम आपसे इंशाल्लाह मुश्किल सवालात भी पूछेंगे, लेकिन जो सबसे अहम मैं समझता हूँ इसका जो मकसद है, and this is both going to be disappointing for some people but a relief for others, is that this is not like a gotcha conversation. We're not trying to trip anyone up, and obviously as politicians you have the full right and responsibility, I would think, to show off a little bit and to tell people about the hard work that you're doing. And then in return, I think both myself, Maheen, and of course others through the course of the conversation, but after about an hour, we'll start getting other people in. We're already through 15 minutes. And so uh, maybe let's formally kick off, obviously in the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, once again, salam and thanks to everyone that's joining in. I think it's an incredibly important topic. And the fact that we have this kind of interest is great. The fact that we have two ministers who are willing to engage in this kind of conversation at 10 p.m. Pakistan time, I think says a lot about maybe our sleeping habits, but I think more importantly about the importance that they give to this venue or this medium of communication. Very grateful to both of them, and this is of course one more in a series of conversations of this nature that the Tabadlab has been hosting.
Mosharraf,
Uh,
on a lighter note, I think the inertia of just finishing the budget yesterday is also keeping us going and mentally present at 10 p.m.
Fantastic. I hope there'll be lots of lighter notes. Let me start, Hashim Saab, with you and pose the key challenge. There's this conversation the last 20 hours or so about infrastructure, and I don't want to get into that conversation. But what I do want to get into is the need to spend money. Like I think one of the criticisms I had of the austerity that you know welcomed this government, I actually think ये फैसला केयर टेकर्स ने किया था ऑस्टेरिटी का, लेकिन अगेन मैं उसमें नहीं जाता कि ऑस्टेरिटी अच्छी है बुरी है, लेकिन जब ऑस्टेरिटी होती है तो आपके पास अवाम पे खर्च करने के लिए पैसे नहीं होते, तो अवाम पे खर्च करें, जैसे भी आप खर्च करें, आपको इलेक्शन आपने जीता है, आप उसको हेल्थ पे करें, पानी पे करें, रोडों पे करें, दैट्स रियली इन मेनी वेज आपकी सवाबदीद है. The question is for politicians, and this is really important, I think for us all to openly discuss कि सियासतदान के लिए पेंशन रिफॉर्म जैसी चीज या पब्लिक फाइनेंशियल मैनेजमेंट रिफॉर्म जैसी चीज या रेवेन्यू बढ़ाने जैसी चीज ये कितना कोई मुश्किल है. लाइक इट सीम्स टू मी दैट इट्स काउंटर इंटुइटिव to the existence or to the identity of a Pakistani politician, that instead of showing off about how much they've spent, they'd be showing off about how much tax they've collected and how much money they've saved. So just walk us through, Hashim, from your perspective in the Punjab, what that journey has been like and why you were invested in a reform effort. And then obviously I'll bring this question to Taimur as well. Hashim.
Mosharraf, this is very interesting what you put forward. It's a dilemma which I think most policymakers deal with. आपको इस वक्त पाकिस्तान शॉर्ट टर्म डिसीजंस लेता लेता जहां पहुंच गया है because the myopic horizon is limited to just 5 years of your own tenure. But all the actual fault lines which have now developed are because we have been only focusing on short term measures. We are not looking at what the other government, next government, will inherit. And in fact, this is one thing which I intend to leave. I thought I will leave a transition note for the future incumbent who will be replacing me one day, so that he knows what all longer term measures we worked on, so that perhaps if he feels that this would be of interest to him, he should carry on those measures. There is a reason why I think we are being forced also to look in this direction. That is that if we do not, some of the numbers, some of the indicators have become quite alarming. Uh, Pensions is one of them. It's crowding out space, and sooner or later, if this is left unattended, it will become the Punjab or the KPK or all provinces, they will become post offices. So all you will be doing is you will be processing salaries and pensions, and there will not be that development aspect which is very much required. क्योंकि हमारे अपनी सारों की रिक्वायरमेंट्स है, प्रोविंसेस की डिफरेंट रिक्वायरमेंट्स है, विद इन प्रोविंसेस डिफरेंट रिक्वायरमेंट्स है, किसी की सोशल सेक्टर की है, किसी की आपको एक इंडस्ट्रियल पॉलिसी को फॉलो कराना है, किसी की एसईजी एस्टैब्लिश करनी है, रीजनली भी ये चीज़ें डिफरेंट है. तो हमें आईएमएफ और जो ये नया हमने 2018 के बाद एग्रीमेंट्स किए हैं, उसके बाद we had to also look inwards where to create space. We had to start contributing to be more prudent fiscal managers, and B, then we have a certain our on internal audience also, to whom we have promised in our manifesto various things for which we need substantial amount of cash. And स्कीम्स जो हमने शुरू करनी थी, दैट हैज आल्सो प्रॉम्प्टेड कि हमने रिफॉर्म्स करनी है। जब ये प्रिंसिपल डिसीजन जो है ना, देखें, पंजाब में 11 लाख मुलाजिम है, या आप 11 लाख मुलाजिम के लिए जो गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स हैं, या आप इनके लिए काम करते रहें कि इनकी तनख्वाहें और पेंशन जाती रहे, विच इज मोर देन 70% ऑफ योर रेवेन्यूज, फॉर द 11 करोड़ आवाम जिनको आप वो सर्विस दे रहे हैं जिसमें वो अपने स्कूल में अपने बच्चों को नहीं भेज रहे, ये गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स। There was something really off. This needed to be fixed, and the easiest two three fixes are कि हम पेंशन्स के अंदर सर्टेन चीजों को एड्रेस करें। इट्स गुड टू हैव a pension scheme. It is good to have even a generous pension scheme, but it is not a replacement for a social welfare scheme. तो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता करके इस चीज को बड़ा केयरफुली डिसाइफर किया गया है, and Taimur is also working on very good initiatives which is taken, and with the federal government we are now wanting कि in cohesion सारे सूबे और एनएफसी के अंदर भी हमने इसको एक वन ऑफ द मेन एजेंडा आइटम्स बनाया था कि जो डिस्कशन ग्रुप्स भी बने उसमें दिस इज नाउ अ रियल एंड प्रेजेंट डेंजर टू ओवरऑल फाइनेंशियल फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी ऑफ ऑल प्रोविंसेस एंड द सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट। तो इस पे काम करना चाहिए सबको मिलके, और सब अगर इकट्ठे मिलके सोचेंगे तो हेडविंड भी कम होगी। लॉजिकल तरीके से इसको जो बाकी मुल्कों की प्रैक्टिसेस हैं वो देखते हुए हम आगे चलें, एंड सर्टनली हर प्रोविंस ने अपनी एंड पे वेरियस रिफॉर्म्स अभी से शुरू कर दी हैं। अगर आप चाहें तो वी कैन गो इनटू द डिटेल्स ऑफ दिस रिफॉर्म्स एट दिस वेरी स्टेज, और वी कैन हाईलाइट देम at a later. I don't know what sort of a format you would like me to run with. Would you like me to
I
stop
would
here?
love it if we. I would love it if we sort of kept it sort of flowing, and we brought in Taimur at this stage, Hashim Saab. But we'll definitely keep coming back to you. And then, obviously, I'm delighted that Maheen Rahman has joined us. Maheen, I've already introduced you. Folks that want to learn more about Maheen should definitely look her up. She's a phenomenal leader in the financial sector, and she'll bring a important private sector perspective to everything. So we'll come to Maheen in a second, but I wanted to take the conversation to Taimur. And Taimur, I wanted to ask you about the imperative, much like I did with Hashim, that it's not possible for a politician, at least in my reckoning, to suddenly be seized with the idea of a complex reform in the way that pensions are a complex reform. And so maybe just describe, first of all, your experience of becoming finance minister, getting a hold of the expanse of the responsibility and the challenges, and then what would seize you to be, in a sense, interested. What is it that you're doing, but more importantly, why are you doing it? Taimur Saab.
जी देखिए, मेरे ख्याल में अगर आप इवन एज अ पॉलिटिशियन सिर्फ शॉर्ट टर्म सोचें कि मेरे पास ये टर्म है, इस टर्म में मैंने हल्के के लिए कुछ करना है और आगे का देखा जाएगा, तो वो तो 70 साल से हो रहा है। उसमें जो चैलेंज आहिस्ता आहिस्ता आ जाता है, हाशिम ने भी इस पे बात की, वो ये है कि हर 5 साल फिर पिछले 5 सालों से ज्यादा टाइट होते हैं, और आहिस्ता आहिस्ता वो स्क्वीज होते हुए स्पेस होता ही है जो पिछले 3 सालों में हुआ था, जहां पे वी बिलीव कि वी हैड टू क्लीन अप द मेस जो बनाया किसी और ने था, लेकिन जिसकी गालियां अक्सर हमें पड़ती हैं, राइट? तो अगर वो ठीक करना ही है और किसी और ने तो अभी तक नहीं ठीक किया, तो व्हाई नॉट फिक्स इट फॉर द लॉन्ग टर्म? और वो शायद मुशर्रफ आपको इंट्यूटिवली लगे कि एक सियासतदान के लिए करना आसान नहीं है, लेकिन मैं 2 बातें कहूंगा। एक तो ये कि अगर किसी और ने नहीं किया, बिकॉज वी हैड ऑल सॉर्ट्स ऑफ गवर्नमेंट्स, लेफ्ट, राइट, सेंटर, डेमोक्रेटिक, राइट, नॉन डेमोक्रेटिक, ये चीजें हैंडल नहीं हुई, तो हम ही क्यों ना ट्राई करें? एक तो ये चीज, और दूसरी ये चीज कि अगर एक पॉलिटिशियन भी लॉन्ग टर्म में सोचे, अगर सेल्फिशली भी सोचे, और आपने कहा कि इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ पॉलिटिकल लाइफ, हाशिम इज यंग, आई एम रिलेटिवली यंग, अगर आप सोचें कि आपने इस फील्ड में 10, 15, 20 साल कुछ करना है, राइट, तो कुछ आगे के लिए भी राह हमवार करना जो है वो जरूरी है. Because this country cannot just simply be run with the short termism जिसके बारे में हाशिम ने भी बात की. और जो जिन ममालिक ने वो शॉर्ट टर्म टू लॉन्ग टर्म शिफ्ट किया है एटलीस्ट फाइनेंशियल मैनेजमेंट में, तो उसके रिजल्ट्स इतना टाइम नहीं लगता आने के लिए. जब मैं बाहर पढ़ता था तो इंडियन फ्रेंड्स और कुछ इंडियन दोस्त कहते थे कि जब वो 90s में पाकिस्तान में आते थे तो देयर आईज वुड ओपन कि यार पाकिस्तान में चूंकि ज्यादा फ्री मार्केट इकोनॉमी थी, वेस्टर्न गुड्स होते थे और इंडिया की बड़ी क्लोज डोर इकोनॉमी थी. एंड दैट सिचुएशन चेंज्ड आफ्टर 2 decades ऑफ मिसरूल. अब हमें एक अपॉर्चुनिटी है कि वो फिक्स करें. और मेरे ख्याल में पेंशन्स वो एक इशू है बिकॉज इट इज द बिगेस्ट कॉस्ट आइटम जिसके फंडिंग का कोई भी सोल्यूशन किसी ने अभी तक नहीं ढूंढा था, जिसकी वजह से इट बिकम्स अ सॉर्ट ऑफ इशू along with taxation जिस पे आपको स्टैंड किसी हद तक इसलिए लेना जरूरी है दैट इफ यू चेंज दैट आप पूरे मुल्क के माइंडसेट को चेंज कर सकेंगे. और इसमें एक चीज जो हमें हेल्प करती है, हाशिम और मैं अक्सर बात करते हैं कनेक्ट टुगेदर, और उसकी वजह ये कि शायद अकेले एक पॉलिटिशियन के लिए एक मुश्किल स्टेप लेना जो है वो इतना आसान ना हो, लेकिन मिलके एक इकोसिस्टम बन जाता है जिसमें गुड बट डिफिकल्ट स्टेप्स वो लेना ज्यादा आसान हो जाते हैं. So I actually feel कि it's not that difficult. It is difficult, but not that difficult. उसका डिविडेंड politically भी आता है. एंड इट्स इम्पोर्टेंट मेरे ख्याल में जो मीडिया एक रोल उसमें प्ले कर सकता है वो ये कि जब कोई भी गवर्नमेंट, जैसे आप आज बिल्कुल मुश्किल सवाल भी पूछे, लेकिन जब कोई भी गवर्नमेंट उस टाइप के स्टेप्स लेती है जिससे लॉन्ग टर्म ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन आती है, कि the media showcases those, puts the spotlight on those, and encourages government to do more such stuff.
Great. I mean, I think that's a great segue for a whole host of questions I have around the risks जो आप या हाशिम साहब या फेडरल गवर्नमेंट या कोई भी हुकूमत जब भी कोई मुश्किल और अच्छा काम शुरू करती है तो उसमें जो इंटरेस्ट ग्रुप्स का रिएक्शन होता है, जो एक लैक ऑफ अंडरस्टैंडिंग का, क्योंकि हमारा पब्लिक डिस्कोर्स बहुत ज्यादा पर्सनलाइज और बहुत ज्यादा कड़वा जो है हो चुका है. हर मुल्क में है, कोई पाकिस्तान इतना जो है यूनिक उसमें नहीं है. तो इट बिकम्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट इवन आई मीन आपने मिलने की बात की, बड़ा अच्छा होता अगर इसमें हम मजीद और पार्टीज के मेंबरान भी लाते, लेकिन उससे हमारा आज का डिस्कशन जो है वो इट वुड हैव टेकन अ डिफरेंट turn in my estimation, and that's why we have you and Hashim, and I feel comfortable that you guys will be very open to difficult questions. I see a lot of friends who are not PTI supporters who I'm sure will have very constructive and hard questions. But I want to bring Maheen into the conversation, and I must say, Maheen, first of all, great thanks to you because you actually set up finally a Twitter account and then downloaded this thing after 10 p.m. to join the conversation. So pehle to aapka bahut bahut shukriya. Maheen, just for the benefit of everybody listening, I wanted you to set up the conversation a little bit, and obviously we couldn't do that, but let's start now. I wanted you to set up the conversation and explain to everyone listening ke ek unfunded pension system jo hai uski kya implications hain. क्या ये एक नॉर्मल चीज है कि हर साल पेंशन्स के पैसे जो हैं वो उस साल के बजट से आते हैं बनिस्बत एक फंडेड पेंशन सिस्टम के? सो एक्सप्लेन व्हाट दीस टर्म्स मीन एंड एक्सप्लेन कि पाकिस्तान में क्या निजाम है, एंड देन एक्सप्लेन कि इसका और ममालिक में क्या हुआ है और यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है या हो सकता है या होना चाहिए. माहीन.
Okay, thank you, Mosharraf, and thank you for that introduction as well. Very happy to be here on Twitter, finally. You've asked many questions, and maybe the best way to address it is understand what exactly and how exactly the pension a pension scheme is supposed to work. So if we look at it in the context of private sector, and you can extend that example towards the public sector as well, is effectively you have a group of employees who are part of a company or part of a government, and they will eventually retire. At the point of retirement, they will be entitled to their pension savings. Now, this is the way a pension scheme is supposed to work. And when you mention things like funded or unfunded, it's very simple that either the company has created or the government has created an actual fund which takes contributions from the government annually on a salary percentage basis every year. That's what we call a funded system, where there are contributions coming in. Or if it's an unfunded, then there is no funding of that. There's no separate creation of a fund. It is just when somebody becomes eligible for a pension, the government just puts its hand in its pocket and gives that money to that retired employee. Now, let's be clear here that actually no government has, and I'm not talking about Pakistan here. I'll talk globally. That everyone or most governments have not really cracked this one as well as they would like. There are very few governments that can say we have a perfectly funded pension system and we're not worried about the pension liabilities. I think that's a far cry from that. But I do think that within Pakistan specifically, when we look at the way Pakistan's government pension schemes are set up, particularly provincially, because this is a provincial topic, Sindh and Punjab have been running, sort of funded pension schemes for a while now. I don't think the issue comes in the funding side. The issue comes when you realize that whatever you've earned within your fund in the pension scheme is not enough for the liabilities for the future. And I think that's the key core of the matter. Because in order for that pension fund to work and to be able to provide and meet all the liabilities that will happen in the future, the investments inside a pension fund have to hit annually, year on year, a certain rate of return, because they have to meet and match with the sort of annual increments that an employee will get over the life cycle of his employment, whether it is with the government or whether is with a private company. And it has to match a certain degree of, I would say, return or inflation that we have in Pakistan, so that at the end of it, the person is able to withdraw whatever they need from the pension scheme without calling upon the government to fill in the extra, which the fund itself did not manage to earn. So the problem often comes because the understanding of what return is required annually is often not there. And that's actually a very mathematical, actuarial kind of calculation that has to be done. There's a lot of science behind it. But that calculation, once it's done properly, actually tells you what kind of return that fund needs to be earning to ensure that all liabilities are then met without issue in the future. And that's what we call a fully funded kind of pension scheme. So I hope that kind of explains the technicalities of all of this, and we can get into, I think, a later stage on, what is the kind of return profile a pension fund should be looking at, whether it is government or whether it is private sector, because that in itself has also been a matter of debate. And if that return is actually identified, do we even have the means within Pakistan to achieve that return on an annual basis? Do we have the assets available for such a pension scheme to sit in? And I think the real reform on the pension system will come when we actually identify asset classes and asset compositions of funded pension funds that can deliver the kind of return that we need, so that in the future the liability does not balloon out of complete proportion.
I absolutely. I think we'll get to that, and there's a whole kind of I think an encyclopedia worth of content on the importance of potential importance of pensions as drivers of a kind of a renewed focus on capital markets and how
Mm.
could we transform both public and private financial markets in a country like Pakistan. We'll come to that, Maheen, but I think that's a great start. And picking up from I'd like to maybe pass the baton to Hashim Saab and maybe ask you, Hashim, the what mine is just described in terms of an understanding. There's two or three really key issues there. The first is the importance of understanding the need for a funded system and then going out to shop for rates that are competitive and that get you to where you need to go. And then obviously, if you go out shopping, anytime the government tries to procure anything, there's obviously questions around transparency. The bureaucracy has a mortal fear of NAB, which makes political decision making even more difficult. And we've seen that throughout the COVID crisis. So I'd love some commentary from you on that aspect of pension reform. But maybe the most important thing that Maheen said was around the demography, right? That in a country of young people, as the demography shifts, and by 2047, we will peak out our demographic dividend. And so thereafter, this will be an even larger problem, but it's already a growing problem. And the size of the problem will only get bigger from here on in. My thesis, and I want you to react or respond to this, is that the reason we're having this conversation with 40-something ministers in the Punjab and the KP rather than 70-something or 60-something ministers is because 40-something ministers are going to have to deal with the pensions crisis 30 years from now and 20 years from now and 10 years from now. And obviously, Allah miyan sabko zindagi de, but maybe somebody who's in their 70s or 80s isn't thinking that far ahead. Is that an unfair way of framing why, Hashim, you yourself and your colleagues like Taimur are interested in this kind of reform? And then also talk about kind of the issues and the risks and those sorts of things with going out and shopping for a fund, if you will. Hashim Saab.
Is the rate of return. The other, obviously, that is dependent on the size of the fund, how late in a country's or a province life this was started. For example, the federal government thought about it, I believe, a couple of years ago, then it realized it's already too late. So no matter how much they start contributing to a fund, they will never be able to have it substantial enough. जितना भी उसका rate of return आ जाए कि वो कुछ contribute कर सके meaningfully. Punjab में we, I think, have, it's also, up for debate. The size of the fund is now close to 100 billion. It's shy of 100 billion, but we have been adding to it year on year. There are very good avenues, Abibi. Just like Maheen said, that we need to keep on ensuring that the avenues for growth, for the return, we need to see how to maximize them. But abhi bhi अच्छे returns वाले projects आते रहते हैं time and again. And I personally feel that, government के ये IPPP projects जो हैं, these pension funds should be financing them. 17% पहले IRR मिलता था, वो भी dollarized return. I think it was a no-brainer for these pension funds. They should have gone for them and put a couple of them up. Anyways, this wasn't done. And maybe whenever the next round is, this could be one of the possible avenues of growth. Before I get into this, I would like to tackle why we are doing it. I think the entire mandate of PTI's philosophy is to rejig the system, be it whatever assignment we are given, because the system के अब उस लेवल पे वो पहुंच चुका है कि हर चीज को रिविजिट करना जरूरी है और हमारा pretty much पार्टी की philosophy और mandate भी ये है. तो tough decisions लेना, I don't think it is related very much to my age. I think it's more related to my party's philosophy and mandate of change and creating space, doing something different, focusing on human development. So all of those things. पेंशन फंड पे मैं अब थोड़ा सा पंजाब का आपको बताता हूँ. While other provinces are, still in compared to Punjab, I would say more in their embryonic stages in creation of a fund, we have been funding it. Like I said, the size is there, but it is nowhere close to be able to support the annual payments. जिस रेट पे अगर रिटर्न हम इसका एक नॉर्मलाइज्ड एवरेज काइबोर +1 or 2% का भी रिटर्न लगा लें, तब भी आज से ये 20 साल बाद पेंशन के 16% जो एनुअल पेमेंट होगी उसके कंट्रीब्यूशन पे पहुंचेगा. मैंने आते ही इसकी स्टडी करवाई थी, अपनी एक्चुरियल स्टडी, पेंशन की लायबिलिटीज की पेएबल इन फ्यूचर क्या बनती हैं. वो तकरीबन 6.6 ट्रिलियन है एज ऑफ जून 30th की ये है. जो मैंने study करा है, which is approximately 30% of the provincial GDP. So it is quite sizable in terms of the liabilities which await us as a province.
Hashim, could you just repeat that number just for the benefit of everyone listening in case it escaped them?
Gee, it's 6.6 trillion.
And that is what 30% of the GDP of the
Provincial.
province?
Yes, that is 30% of the provincial GDP. But what we can do with this fund, the advantage which Punjab has and what we are toying with is if we go for a defined contribution scheme, if we opt for the new hirees starting now, how we're supposed to recruit them and what their expectations from the government contract which government signs with them in terms of their pension and benefits is, this could very well serve in ensuring that going forward, at least, we have a funded sort of a nature of our contribution scheme. So I think in that way, Punjab has that edge that whatever we now decide in our tenure, in terms of a new combined, if we move from a defined benefit to a defined contribution sort of a scheme, we can really use this fund for those purposes. Maheen mentioned very interestingly on the avenues of growth, and I've seen in other countries, this is evolving. Pension funds have the flexibility and the muscle now to be major players in the market, but I see that that's another question to be, which is part of the discussion which will come later.
That's great, Hashim Saab. I think that size is really, really important. Taimur, I kind of, and I'll come back to Hashim on this, but I want maybe you to speak on this to start with. The question of the degree of openness or the degree of willingness of senior executives, senior bureaucrats, given the risks to their reputation and their well-being. We've seen so many cases of NAB in which senior bureaucrats have got caught up in decisions that were, obviously political, but also bureaucratic. And those official decisions have been questioned both in the public domain, but also by the judiciary and obviously by NAB. How much of a constraint is this issue, or is it overblown in terms of how people talk about the absence of reform and the absence of tough decisions or important decisions purely on the basis of this fear of NAB? To what degree is this a legitimate excuse or explanation for maybe this not happening earlier or this not happening in another province? And what is it that's different about, at least in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and I'll let Hashim Saab address this, for the Punjab, but for you, Taimur, how do you address this issue of bureaucratic competence and willingness on technical reform like public finances?
देखिए, आई थिंक कि जो एक बात आपने कही, नैब का डर तो एक जस्टिफाइबल डर है, जो कि नैब एज एन अकाउंटेबिलिटी वॉचडॉग इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, लेकिन एट द सेम टाइम जो उसके साइड इफेक्ट्स हैं in terms of mitigating the sort of bold action जो कि लोगों को लेना चाहिए लेकिन वो नहीं लेते for fear of adverse accountability, उसका obviously कोई long term solution चाहिए. लेकिन I think एक और भी मैंने जो है वो pensions के लिहाज से एक mindset देखा है कि the civil administration or the bureaucracy is the beneficiary of the pension system, right? तो अगर मुझे कोई चीज मुफ्त की मिल रही है इन अ वे कि उसका लॉन्ग टर्म हिस्टोरिकली ऑटोमेटिकली मिला है, तो इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू टेक द डिसीजन माई सेल्फ टू से कि ये आज से मुझे एक डिफाइंड कंट्रीब्यूशन सिस्टम पे चेंज होना चाहिए. एंड आई थिंक दैट्स व्हाई परहैप्स Hashim या मैं या political governments are in a better place to take these decisions, right, than simply thinking कि ये civil administration खुद से ले लेगी. एक तो मेरे ख्याल में ये point जरूरी है. खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में if you allow me, तो मैं जो हमने 3-4 steps लिए हुए हैं वो भी कह देता हूँ, and I try and answer जो एक चीज मुझे नजर आई है, that I'll give credit both to the civil administration and to our culture. यहाँ पे क्या मुख्तलिफ है जो मुझे लग रहा है कि थोड़ी सी स्पेस दे रही है स्टेप्स लेने को. तो एक तो ये है कि जैसे हाशिम ने कहा 3-4 चीजें हैं, देखें ये एक्चुरियल स्टडी trying to quantify the NPV of pension liabilities, वो horrific numbers दे देती है. The other thing, मैं आपको हाशिम ने 30% provincial GDP का कहा. If you think of it, मेरे पास हाशिम के पास 11 लाख एम्प्लॉइज हैं, मेरे पास 6 लाख हैं, मैं 1.5 लाख की पेंशन आज दे रहा हूँ. थिंक ऑफ इट कि आज से 40 साल बाद मैं 6 लाख एम्प्लॉइज की पेंशन जो है वो दे रहा हूँ, राइट. एंड अनलेस आई थिंक कि वो कहाँ से पैसे आएंगे और कैसे आएंगे, राइट. जस्ट टू गिव यू द कॉन्टेक्स्ट, आज से 15 साल पहले खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में एनुअल पेंशन बिल 1 अरब रुपए भी नहीं था. इट वाज नॉट 1 बिलियन, आई थिंक कोई 700 मिलियन का था, एंड इट वाज लेस देन 1% ऑफ द बजट, राइट. आज वो तकरीबन 100 अरब है, 100 billion. It's risen 100 times in 15 years, and it is 15 to 20% of actual annual spending.
Okay, so just to repeat those numbers, in 15 years, the pension liability has grown in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa from about 1 billion to over 100 billion. So it's a 100x increase in the last 15 years. And this increase, as Taimur was saying, the pace of this growth is going to only increase in the years to come. Taimur, maybe you can disconnect and reconnect. And when you do, we'll bring the mic back to you.
I think it'll have a similar sort of a color as to what we have in Punjab, since you are wanting some numbers here. The 2010 to 11 financial year in Punjab, our expenditure was 36 billion. Last year, which is just closed yesterday, it's 240 billion. So in the last 10 years, let me give you another way of quantifying this. The revenue growth in Punjab from 11 to 2020 has been 11% per annum. Pension expenditure growth has been 20%. In fiscal year 2011, the pension expense to revenue was 6.7%. And this used to be less than 1% 20 years ago. Now it is 15.5%. In KPK, if I'm not mistaken, this is somewhere slightly south of 10%, around 9.3%. So still, from 1% to 9.3%, in our case, from 6.7% in 11 in 10 years to 15.5%. This is a substantial increase. And yes, this should keep any financial manager of a province, on his toes. When we come into, serve our provinces, we, at least as far as our party legacy philosophy is concerned, we do have to have a certain, in fact, a decent amount of weightage is given to longer term policy measures, which needs to be taken. And hence, yes, reforms are inevitable. They have to be done. And I think with the federal government and provinces together talking about it and going collectively with it, I feel that would create less headwind for any one entity to go ahead on its own.
Yeah, thank you for stepping in there. I think Taimur is back. Taimur, you were just describing, and I'd interrupted you because I wanted everyone to understand the impact of those numbers, that 100x increase over 15 years. Please continue from where you left off, and then we'll go to Maheen as soon as you're done.
I think the numbers were so staggering that they disrupted the internet.
network ही बैठ गया.
हाँ, network को ही उसने वो कर दिया. And actually Hashim ne kaha, but we are also at 15 to 16% of our actual budget now being given over to pensions from less than 1%. So very, very similar numbers to Punjab. And I think इस government में और पिछली governments में फर्क है कि ये issues हम आज pick कर रहे हैं. ये मुश्किल हो, आप कहें कि ये politician उठा सकते हैं या नहीं उठा सकते, या आसान है या नहीं है. But that is what good leadership is about. That is what the Prime Minister was talking about yesterday. Right? अगर हमने इस मुल्क को उठाना है, then leadership is about taking difficult decisions, about speaking the truth, right? और उसका dividend आता है. उसी तरीके में कि जो पिछले 3 साल की जो तकलीफ रही है of challenging economic times that required challenging decisions, उन चैलेंजिंग डिसीजंस का इम्पैक्ट आप अभी ग्रोथ नंबर्स में देख सकते हैं। इंशाल्लाह मेरे ख्याल में अगर हम कलेक्टिवली पेंशन रिफॉर्म पे काम करें तो उसका इकोनॉमिक बेनिफिट पूरे मुल्क को भी आएगा। क्योंकि मुस्तकबिल में पेंशन्स का वो प्रेशर नहीं रहेगा, और बहुत जरूरी पेंशनर्स को भी आएगा क्योंकि उनकी पेंशन्स मुस्तकबिल में सिक्योर हो जाएंगे। दिस इज समथिंग दैट पीपल डोंट टॉक अबाउट। आई थिंक इसमें जो सबसे जरूरी होता है या जो हमने सोचा करने का वो ये था कि कुछ एक्शन जल्दी लेना चाहिए। एक स्टेप हमने लिया, फिर पंजाब ने भी लिया, सिंध ने भी लिया, हमारे पास थोड़ी लीगल कॉम्प्लिकेशंस आई, लेकिन फिर जो पंजाब ने लिया था और सिंध ने लिया था हमें दोबारा लेने में आसानी हुई। दैट वाज इंक्रीजिंग द अर्ली रिटायरमेंट एज। रिटायरमेंट एज बढ़ा के हमें कोई साल के 12-13 अरब रुपए जो है वो बचते हैं अर्ली रिटायरमेंट एज बढ़ा के। दूसरी चीज, वी हैव जस्ट एनैक्टेड रिवाइज्ड पेंशन रूल्स। अगर आप पाकिस्तान में पेंशन हायरार्की देखें तो टिपिकली आप कहीं भी पूछ ले, द पेंशन इज अ रिटायरमेंट राइट अर्न्ड बाय एन एम्प्लॉय जो कि 20-30 साल काम करता है, जो कि ज्यादा से ज्यादा डायरेक्ट डिपेंडेंट्स को उसके ट्रांसफर होती है जब तक कि वो डिपेंडेंट्स होते हैं। यहाँ पे वो डायरेक्ट डिपेंडेंट्स यानी बच्चों या स्पाउस के अलावा ग्रैंड चिल्ड्रन, the spouses of grandchildren, brothers, sisters, parents, or you go on. My grandfather was a civil servant who passed away 20 years ago, and I calculated कि अगर मैं चाहूं मैं उनकी पेंशन आज भी रिवाइव कर सकता हूं, whereas he retired in the mid-70s, right? That is how our pension system was. हमने वो रूल्स चेंज किए। जो हाशिम ने बात की कि हम फ्यूचर एम्प्लॉइज को, मुस्तकबिल के मुलाजमीन को एक डिफाइंड कंट्रीब्यूशन सिस्टम में लेके जाए, कैबिनेट ने वो फैसला लिया कि हम सिविल सर्वेंट एक्ट चेंज करेंगे ताकि 1 जुलाई 21 के बाद जो एम्प्लॉइज ज्वाइन करेंगे they will need to partake in a defined contribution system. और जो हमारा भी पेंशन फंड एक बना हुआ था which has a substantial amount of money, 50 billion rupees, we realize, जैसे हाशिम ने फेडरल गवर्नमेंट का भी कहा, कि जब हमारा पेंशन बिल ही 100 अरब रुपए का है तो क्रिएटिंग अ पेंशन फंड ऑफ 50 बिलियन वो 100 साल में भी पेंशन लायबिलिटीज को फुली नहीं कवर कर सकता। बिकॉज इट्स नॉट कि आप काइबोर के ऊपर 1 या 2 या 3% ग्रोथ करके वो कहीं 5-10 साल में पहुंच जाएगा। बिकॉज पेंशन ग्रोथ इज एट 20 to 22% per annum, and it is guaranteed to be at that amount for the next 40 years, because we know exactly कि हर साल कितने एम्प्लॉइज ऐड हुए और कितने एम्प्लॉइज रिटायर होंगे, राइट? तो ये तो आई थिंक एक हमने यहाँ पे स्टडी की कि विद इन द नेक्स्ट 10 years अगर हम अभी शिफ्ट ना करें तो 10 साल के अंदर बेसिकली जो गवर्नमेंट के रिसोर्सेज हैं will only be enough to pay salaries or pensions, या फिर लोगों के पेंशन नहीं दिए जाएंगे। So now put it that way and you suddenly understand कि आपको या एक फंडेड या डिफाइंड कंट्रीब्यूशन या एक मिक्स्ड ऐसे सिस्टम क्यों इजाद करना है, और या फिर यू कैन पास द कैन डाउन द रोड बट इट वोंट गो डाउन वेरी फार। एंड आई थिंक इस मुल्क की बदकिस्मती ये रही है, एंड दिस इज समथिंग दैट द प्राइम मिनिस्टर हैज not only pushed us to do but tried to create the culture to do, कि इस टाइप के इश्यूज पे कोई बात ही नहीं हुई। वन इंटरेस्टिंग थिंग, एंड आई एंड विद दैट, खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में 2004-5 में एक कंट्रीब्यूटरी पेंशन स्कीम बनाया गया था। दिस बाय द वे वाज द सेम टाइम जब इंडिया का नेशनल पेंशन प्रोग्राम जो है वो बनाया गया था, दैट शिफ्टेड देम from an unfunded defined benefit program to a contributory program. To date, as I understand, the pensions issue in India is largely solved because वो जो legislation हुई थी, उस पे अमल हुआ, and it's in place now, और वो pension program अभी सिर्फ civil servants के लिए नहीं है. They have extended that to become a universal pension scheme, जिसमें private sector भी हिस्सा ले सकता है. खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में वो बना. The will to implement it wasn't there. 10 साल it remained a legislation. और 2012 में, a year before PTI came into power, it was scrapped and the old system was revived. And as a result, जो मैं कह रहा हूं कि वो जो 1 अरब की pension liabilities थी actually साल की, वो 100 अरब हो गई. And whereas think of it कि जब 1 अरब की थी और उस वक्त हमने लोगों को cap किया होता, and we had a contributory pension mechanism, I could have had 100 billion rupees extra in my budget that could have gone on social welfare, that could have gone on education, that could have gone on developing economic infrastructure. लेकिन सिर्फ वो कुछ short-sighted decisions का जो impact होता है, that today we are paying in the form of 100 billion rupees a year, growing by 20% annually.
Again, it's a real I think education, and I hope it is for everyone listening in terms of how you're thinking about these things. 2 things I want to do in terms of housekeeping, and then Maheen, I want to ask you about the potential that this conversation has from a private sector perspective. So this isn't really just about pensioners, and it's not really about balanced budgets. It's foundationally actually about what funded pensions could do for capital markets and the impact it could have on the overall financial sector. That's the question I want to bring to you, Maheen. But before I ask you to respond, and I'll ask you to unmute your mic when you do, before I do that, I just quickly want to acknowledge my old and dear friend Zubair Abbasi is here, the host of Pakistanomy, our podcast that Uzair Yunus hosts. Uzair is here. My colleague Ambareem Shamsi is here. I see some other great friends, including Shahrukh Bani and Naseem Beg. And I just noticed Azaz Akhtar Dad is in the room as well. So in about 10 minutes, we're going to start opening it up, and I'll ask others to jump in. And if I've been too nice to the 2 ministers from PTI, then people who feel that way should come in and ask much harder questions. But before we do that, Maheen, can you just break down for us the potential that this conversation has, and if this conversation goes well, just throw out some numbers if you feel comfortable doing so, as to what a fully funded pension system might mean for capital markets in Pakistan, and also explain what that in and of itself means in kind of plain English or Urdu.
Okay, so first I'll pick up on the number which Taimur Saab mentioned, which was 22% growth in the value that's required on the pension side. So let's just be clear, the 22% annually for the next 10 years, I'm not sure there's too many asset classes, in fact any asset classes in Pakistan that will be able to deliver something like that. So then we have to go back and we have to see, well, what can be done. Now I have 2 questions for both the gentlemen speakers. Is one, look, if there has been such an exponential increase in the pension contribution, what are we doing, one, in terms of the annual salary increase of government employees? I understand that there are many repercussions on that, but I think given that kind of growth rate which you're seeing is clearly going to be unsustainable from a funding perspective. And the second point is also in terms of size of government. And I think that is something that affects the federal, provincial levels both. Because as you add more and more people and as government gets bigger as an entity, that pension liability is slowly going to begin to take over those resources, as you mentioned. So I think that's one point that really needs to be considered. I think the second point is, well, I would say by and large, both the Sindh Pension Fund, the Punjab Pension Fund, and any other, I would say probably even private sector pension fund that you will pick up right now is probably 70 to 80% invested in government securities, which are just going to give you a sort of inflation-adjusted kind of return, and nowhere near, and probably just preserve the value of the money in there, but with nowhere near in terms of real return. So the question to ask really then is, what are the investable assets that pension funds should be looking at? And that's where I think you can draw examples from the rest of the world, which have certainly not got it down perfect, but are probably better diversified in terms of their investing avenues. Now, pension schemes are long-term schemes. It is 30 years or 25 years before an employee, from the point they start to the point they are eligible for a pension. In that case, when you have that contribution coming regularly, assume that you have a funded pension plan and you have a contribution that is coming regularly, this should not be looked at from a perspective of investing in short-term government treasury bills or even 10-year government bonds. It should be looking at what other avenues, such as that are available, and there are need in Pakistan for those avenues right now, in particular in the infrastructure space, in the capital market space. For example, when we pick up the sizes of not just Punjab pension fund, Sindh pension fund, you can pick up EOBI, you can pick up State Life, you can pick up WWF, you can pick up Sindh WWF, you can pick up all these funds which the government has created under its various provincial and federal entities, and you run into well over, I would imagine, ₹1 trillion just sitting there invested in 80% government securities. And they're all long-term funds. So why can we not redirect these funds towards projects which are commercially viable, which the government or the private sector wishes to take on, whether they are in real estate, whether they are in housing, whether they are in other needed infrastructure? Channel them there. It may not get you to 20% annually, but it certainly will get you well beyond the government treasury mark. And that way you at least create a long-term source of funds for local infrastructure in the country, whether it is through capital markets or through other financial instruments, and really push out a bit more innovation in terms of the investing avenues of such large funds in such pension schemes. And thereby you will not, I think, completely close the gap, but you will certainly get a lot closer than what we are sitting on right now, and allow some degree of control as to the exponential increase on the pension side. But I think you certainly have to do that with some consideration towards salary increases as well as size of government. So that's just the way I think that this will need to be tackled, I think, going forward.
Maheen, just to deepen and widen
Mosharraf,
people's
I'd like to respond quickly if possible.
Of course, Taimur, please go ahead.
I think Maheen's reaction points to something which is very interesting. I think even experts at the moment aren't fully aware of the scale of the problem, right? I think it just, for example, hit her as to what 20% growth actually means. I'm glad कि ये बात अभी हो रही है, and credit to you for picking this up, because at the moment this is not an issue. We have all these financial journalists making a big deal कि फलाने सूबे के ऊपर कर्जा इतना है, या इस महीने जो है वो एक्सपोर्ट $2 ऊपर चला गया या $2 नीचे चला गया, and people are simply missing one of the elephants in the room, right? And I think if the right pressure is put on governments on the right areas, it becomes easier for people like Hashim and me to put reform on a faster track than it is. I think, by the way, we have to do everything that Maheen is saying. And these are real conversations that I've certainly had with Hashim, I've had with Shaukat Tareen Saab. We had a discussion on how to and in fact, we are hopefully going to create a committee that's going to look at both how to take steps on the pension issue, as well as on resolving things like the size of government, as well as the competitiveness of salaries, but to look at distortion in salary between public and private sector. And it surprisingly doesn't always work in the private sector size. लेकिन fundamentally कोई solution तो जो है वो करना पड़ेगा. And there I think there is more room for creative space than we tend to believe there is. To my mind and to my limited understanding, एक और solution space था where I must commend some of the senior officers of our province for agreeing with me to take what I think was a very bold step. और वो है एक alternative किस्म की pension funding जो French system अभी तक था जब तक उनकी size of government बढ़ रही थी, which was more of a what they call a pay as you go system, कि जो employees system में होते हैं वो जो रिटायर होते हैं उनकी पेंशन की तरफ कुछ कंट्रीब्यूशन जो है वो करते हैं, तो एटलीस्ट आपका पेंशन सिस्टम पार्शली फंड होता है। और इस साल जो हम सैलरी रेजेस दे रहे थे, और उसका भी एक पूरा सिस्टम है पाकिस्तान में जहां पे एक सूबा देता है, फिर दूसरा देता है, फिर फेडरल गवर्नमेंट देती है, फिर हर कोई दूसरे से 2-2 रुपए और ज्यादा देता है, फिर वापस पहले सूबे को दोबारा देना पड़ता है। When we were going through this cycle of salary increases this time round, and I must commend the senior DMG and PMS officers in KP, they agreed that part of their salary raise would go towards effectively creating the first pay-as-you-go pension mechanism. And even though their contribution may be nominal, I think it is a huge step in the right direction. और अभी जब हाशिम और मैं बैठेंगे, जब हम शौकत तरीन साहब के साथ बैठेंगे, it massively increases the solution space. But I think उसको सही तरह से करने के लिए we need experts like Maheen on board as well. We need a sense of urgency जो आज से पहले नहीं रही. And we also need the media and opinion makers to shed the right spotlight on this. Because last word, ये हमारा पैसा नहीं है. ये ultimately आपका पैसा है. As citizens, this is the money that we're using, whatever we use it for, whether we use it for government salaries, pensions, or development. The money that we talk about belongs to the Pakistani public and the Pakistani nation.
Well said, Taimur. I think no question. This is an issue that needs more attention. I want to turn to maybe a couple of more sort of challenging questions, including one that मुझसे खास जो है वो किसी ने कहा था कि ये जरूर पूछेगा, तो मैं एक्चुअली ये हाशिम से भी पूछूंगा और फिर तैमूर साहब आप भी जो है इस पे कुछ मतलब रोशनी फरमाइएगा। Some people are concerned that pension reform actually is just a way of changing the terms of engagement between the state and public sector employees. Basically, पैसे बचाने के लिए वो जो है पेंशनें जो है वो काट रहे हैं, बेवाओं को जो है वो कम कर देंगे। एक खास जो सवाल आया था वो ये कि कोई माजूर हो जिसका कोई पेरेंट जो है वो पेंशनर थे, वो अगर गुजर जाते हैं तो क्या माजूरों के लिए कोई स्पेशल फैसिलिटी होगी, या कि इस रिफॉर्म में बेसिकली पैसे बचाने की एक मुहिम है। तो इस पे आई नो द आंसर टू दिस, बट आई थिंक मैंने जेन्युइनली और जानबूझ के ये मैं इस तरह फ्रेम कर रहा हूँ बिकॉज आई थिंक दैट कंसर्न नीड्स टू बी एड्रेस्ड हेड ऑन। Maybe Hashim, maybe you can address it first, and then we can take it to Taimur, and then we'll close the first round with Maheen, and then we'll start opening it up for both commentary and questions from the folks I mentioned, but also from others who've had their hand up and want to ask questions. So, Hashim Saab, how do you deal with this question about कि जी pensioners के साथ ज्यादती तो नहीं होने लगी?
देखिए, ये apprehensions जो हैं, rest assured, मैंने पहले भी आपको जिक्र किया था कि हमारे actions जो हैं, they are basically manifestations of our party's philosophy. The Prime Minister, if you see the airtime, he talks about the maximum amount of time is given to the concept of the Riyasat-e-Madina. So it is, the social welfare is embedded in our entire philosophy of PTI. The bringing about of SARS program. In fact, Punjab started its own SARS program. Having said that, we will be looking at pensions as an occupational employer-based scheme in which, yes, the families will be catered for. It has to provide a source of comfort and security to the pensioner and to his immediate family as well. Having said that, जिस तरह आपने एक एग्जांपल ली, ऑफ कोर्स उसको सपोर्ट करना चाहिए। ऑफ कोर्स हमारे पास खाली ये एक मीन्स नहीं है, हमारे पास पंजाब सोशल प्रोटेक्शन अथॉरिटी है, फेडरल प्रोग्राम्स है। हमने तो खास तौर पे हम कदम शुरू किया है, हमने ट्रांसजेंडर के लिए अलग शुरू किया है, हमने बर्न विक्टिम्स के लिए अलग किया। तो जो सोशल सिक्योरिटी नेट इन पाकिस्तान थ्रू वेरियस डायरेक्ट इंटरवेंशंस इज आल्सो ग्रोइंग, दैट will keep on growing, that our focus will remain on. इसमें भी जो rationalization आएगी वो ये है कि it should be a pension scheme, it should cater for such eventualities जिसमें ऐसे cases आ जाते हैं, but over and above इसको, इसकी जो nature है उसको बाकी मुल्कों के साथ, बाकी मुस्लिम ममालिक के साथ भी it has to have some sort of a semblance कि हमने किस डिग्री तक इसको लेके जाना है, और बाकी हमने सोशल सेक्टर अपने सेफ्टी नेट्स कहाँ कहाँ क्रिएट करने हैं। इसमें ज़रूरी नहीं है कि हम इसकी जेनरस नेचर को हम टारगेट कर रहे हैं। इसमें दिस इज नॉट द आइडिया, दिस इज नॉट व्हाट वी आर वांटिंग टू डू। वी हैव अ वेरी पब्लिक सेंट्रिक, इवन हमारे गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स और उनकी फैमिली के लिए भी हम कोई ऐसी चीज नहीं सोच रहे, ना करना चाहेंगे। बट जहाँ पे जिस तरह ये हमने खत्म किया अर्ली रिटायरमेंट का, अब आप किसी को भी ले लें जो गवर्नमेंट सर्विस में आता है, उसका एक सर्टेन एक्सपीरियंस के बाद उसका कंट्रीब्यूशन टू द सिस्टम बढ़ जाता है। बट वो देखते ही हैं कि लार्ज नंबर ऑफ पीपल वर रिटायरिंग इवन बिलो 55, सो व्हाट दे वर डूइंग वाज दे वर रिटायरिंग एंड देन टेकिंग अप अनदर जॉब इन द प्राइवेट सेक्टर, ताकि यहाँ से पेंशन भी, जो कि तनख्वाह से इन मेनी केसेस एट टाइम्स इज इवन मोर जेनरस, और साथ साथ दूसरी नौकरी भी शुरू करें। सो दैट इज one of the few things which we are discouraging. So we will address it. We will be taking cognizance कि हम ऐसी कोई चीज ना करें जिससे इसकी अफादियत या जो इसका मेन पर्पस है, टू प्रोवाइड सिक्योरिटी एंड कंफर्ट टू द पीपल, टू द गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स एंड देयर फैमिलीज इन ओल्ड एज, उसको कोई किसी तरीके से कोई एप्रीहेंशन है तो वी विल एड्रेस दैट। बट इसमें अनोमलीज जो हैं उसको हम जरूर एड्रेस करेंगे।
I think, Hashim, I must say that's an incredibly impressive framing, and I think, you know, as politicians, it's maybe harder to be a little harsher about this. But Taimur, I'll come to you, and then Maheen, like I said, then I'll ask you to close off this kind of first round, and then we'll bring in others. Taimur, this issue of kind of people essentially taking deliberate advantage of the system, isko up full frontally, do you feel comfortable taking this on? Are you able to take this on, or are there too many liabilities in terms of political cost and interest group mobilization that make it difficult? I mean, it sounds to me like somebody, if they're 45, 46, 47, and they're taking an early retirement, or jaise Hashim sahab ne kaha 55 saal ki umar pe, which I think maybe less kind of toxic, but certainly, you know, much younger ages. How do you deal with that challenge? Because that's clearly a challenge of abuse of system, is it not, Taimur?
देखिए, जब आपके पास जो सिस्टम होते हैं when they are poorly designed, तो उनके बहुत से बुरे साइड इफेक्ट्स होते हैं, that when you fix one thing, तो वो सारे इवन बहुत से अनइंटेंडेड पॉजिटिव फिक्सेस आते हैं। आप एक उसका कह रहे हैं 45 साल में बंदा रिटायर हो जाता है जानबूझ के कि वो पेंशन भी उठाए, प्राइवेट सेक्टर में जॉब भी करे। हमारे सिस्टम में ऐसे भी लोग थे कि वो 2-2, 3-3 पेंशन उठा रहे थे, राइट, या कि वो तनख्वाह भी उठा रहे थे और किसी की पेंशन भी उठा रहे थे, जो कि दुनिया में कहीं पे टिपिकली नहीं होता। जो आपने बात की, जब आप पेंशन रिफॉर्म की बात करते हैं, तो किसी ने कहा कि जब पहले इसकी बात हुई तो एक हेडलाइन लोकल न्यूज़पेपर में आया कि बेवाओं की पेंशन जो है वो काट रहे हैं, जबकि इट्स द एग्जैक्ट ऑपोजिट। जैसे हाशिम ने कहा, पीटीआई की फिलॉसफी हो, इंसानियत की फिलॉसफी हो, जब आप अच्छा काम करते हैं उससे अपॉर्चुनिटी ज्यादा मिलती है। तो जब हमने पेंशन रूल्स चेंज किए और ये जो 14 लेयर्स थे, सन, डॉटर, विडो डॉटर, grandson, granddaughter, widow granddaughter, brother, sister, father, mother, हमने हालांकि टिपिकली डिपेंडेंट्स तक रिस्ट्रिक्ट हुआ था, एक्चुअली टेकिंग द कंपैशनेट व्यू जो हमें लेना चाहिए हमने पाकिस्तानी सोसाइटी के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में माँ बाप को शामिल किया रिवाइज्ड क्राइटेरिया में, बिकॉज यहाँ पे मेरे ख्याल में आप सोचें कि खुदा न खास्ता कोई जो है वो पेंशनर की अगर डेथ हो जाए और उसके माँ बाप जिंदा हैं और उस पर डिपेंड करते हैं, तो व्हाट डिफरेंस वुड इट मेक कि अगर हम उनको वाकई वो 4 5 10 साल सपोर्ट करें। पहली चीज। दूसरी चीज, जब हमने ये बाकी जो 8 9 लेयर्स को हटाया, तो वी एक्चुअली टुक द कॉन्शियस डिसीजन कि वेदर विडोज, डिसेबल्ड या फिर चिल्ड्रन, कि वो जो लेयर्स रह जाते हैं, आपको पता है कि क्योंकि वो सिस्टम अनफंडेड था, तो हर जगह आप पैसे बचाने की कोशिश कर रहे होते हैं। तो वो anyone other than the direct pensioner, उसको पेंशन का 75% मिलता था। तो वी सेड कि जब लेयर्स कम हो जाएंगे, तो वेदर द विडो, the children, whether dependent or whether disabled or whether not disabled, उनको 100% पेंशन मिलेगा। तो उल्टा तो जो है वी इंक्रीज्ड, बिकॉज आप सोचें अगर कोई पेंशनर की डेथ हो जाए, तो it is quite likely कि his widow or his children, forget whether they are disabled or not, कि उनको पैसों की ज्यादा जरूरत होगी। तो why would you cut their pension to 75%? लेकिन जब मैं सिस्टम का अब्यूज खत्म कर देता हूं, तो मेरे लिए वो 100% फंड करना ज्यादा आसान हो जाता है। और सिमिलरली, अगर if we take some radical quick steps towards resolving the funding of pensions in the future, तो सारे पेंशनर्स की सिक्योरिटी एक्चुअली ज्यादा होगी, जॉब कॉन्फिडेंस ज्यादा होगी, और हमारे लिए मजीद जो स्टेप्स है गवर्नमेंट के साइज का, एक अच्छा प्राइवेट सेक्टर जॉब मार्केट का क्रिएट करना भी आसान हो जाएगा। एक और भी साइड इफेक्ट आप सोचें कि चूंकि पेंशन्स अनफंडेड है, rather than a defined contributory system जहां पे आप अपनी 10% सैलरी कंट्रीब्यूट करते हैं, गवर्नमेंट मैचिंग कंट्रीब्यूशन करता है, और चाहे वो ट्रेजरीज में, वो गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज में वो पैसे जो है वो इन्वेस्टेड हो, या कोई और जो है वो इन्वेस्टमेंट्स में जो है वो पैसे लगे हुए हो, what that enables you to do is कि आप गवर्नमेंट की सर्विस 4 साल बाद, 5 साल बाद, 10 साल बाद आप छोड़ें, आप छोड़ के अपने पैसे जो है वो ले जा सकते हैं। अगर आप सबको मुफ्त की अनफंडेड पेंशन दे रहे हैं, तो फिर आपको वो रूल रखना पड़ेगा कि आपने 25 साल काम करना होगा तो आपको पेंशन मिलेगी, जिसका मतलब कि कोई गवर्नमेंट की सर्विस को छोड़ता ही नहीं है अगर वो काम करना ही ना चाहे, या अगर उसको बेहतर अपॉर्चुनिटी भी मिल जाए, क्योंकि उसने 25 साल गुजारने होते हैं ताकि उसे पेंशन का 1 रुपए भी मिल जाए। तो दिस इज अनदर साइड इफेक्ट जो कि खत्म हो जाएगा, और जब ये खत्म हो जाएगा, तो the private sector will become more competitive and a better alternative to government, right? Because आप गवर्नमेंट में 2 3 साल रह भी सकेंगे, छोड़ भी सकेंगे, और जो गवर्नमेंट की एक इनहेरेंट अट्रैक्टिवनेस है कि जी वो मुफ्त की पेंशन देता है और 25 साल के काम करने या ना करने के बाद देता है, that will be normalized to be in sync with the rest of the job market. तो आई थिंक कि एक्चुअली इसके फवाइद जो है they will exist on multiple dimensions. We just need to continue to take small step after small step, and ideally take them together, and ideally backed by public discourse like the one we're having right now.
There's no question about the utility of this, and of course I'm personally sold. Maheen, the last kind of comment, and this is a little bit more negative. I mean, like I said, there's I mentioned the capital markets because I think that's one of the economy's kind of weak links, and I don't see the kind of growth this country needs possible without the stock markets and equity markets substantially changing. And I think pension reforms, especially if there's some legislation, if leaders like Hashim and Taimur, take more and more center stage on this question, but there's no reason for us to assume that we won't see the development of improved capital markets. But I wanted to talk about the downside risk here as well a little bit, that the potential of systemic risk I mean, the existence of systemic risk, one in places where you do have large pension funds, the kind of influence they can wield over the system, if there are any bad actors, and there could be two kinds of bad actors, people with bad luck and people with bad intentions. In all of those cases, how do you see risk mitigation? Let's say there's a large pension fund, and Taimur and Hashim are successful, and there are people who come after them in other provinces, in the same provinces. They're also successful. We have large pension funds. We have massively improved and increased in size capital markets. But then you have, we also live in a country जहाँ मेहरान बैंक भी हुआ है, दीगर और इस तरह की चीजें होती रहती हैं. और PTI की बात हो रही थी. The PTI itself has been a great contributor to the narrative around, the suspicion of, rightly so, the suspicion of public officials when money decisions are being made. So how do we deal with the question of systemic risk? Because a lot of bureaucrats are just going to say, this is all good in theory, लेकिन ये जाके आप न्यूयॉर्क या लंदन में ट्राई करें, यहाँ पे नहीं चलेगा, क्योंकि यहाँ पे कोई चोरी करेगा और पूरा सिस्टम जो है बैठ जाएगा. How would you respond to that, Maheen?
Because I'd respond by throwing out some numbers here. So, you have pension liabilities that accrue over, say, 25, 30 years. So, any guesses on what the stock market return on a 25, 30-year basis has been in Pakistan? It's north of about 28, 27% a year, right? So there's one answer to that systemic risk. Now, you can argue that the 10-year return is at 15, or the 15-year return is, at 14. But, the reality is, on a long-term basis, capital markets do pay off. And they've paid off for a lot of people and that actually participate in those capital markets. So any investing has to be done with your eyes open. And it doesn't mean that just because the stock market has thrown out, say, 30% over 25 years, that 100% of the fund ends up, in the stock market in that hope. No, certainly not. I think in any kind of investing, whether you have a small amount or a large amount to put in, the elements of investing or the theory behind it never go away. And those are related to diversification of risk. Those are related to making sure the portfolio is balanced in terms of all its components, and making sure that you have a desired or target return in mind, which you hope to achieve. It may not hit in 1 year, but it may hit after 10 years, and it certainly may hit after 20, 30 years. So, by and large, diversified books do work, and they work here in Pakistan and they work globally. When we talk about systemic risk, I would take you back to, say, 2008 financial crisis, where Lehman Brothers collapsed. Now, was that because Lehman had, because there were no checks and balances within their system? Of course they were. They just didn't work. But at that point, but that's something that, as you get beyond the government securities type of investing profiles, those are the kind of risks that you learn to take within a portfolio and that you learn to mitigate. And here's where I think there's a lot to learn from how investors in Pakistan's capital markets have managed their risks. I think there are private sector products available that can address some of the issues related around risk versus return in pension funds very easily. The voluntary pension systems run by mutual funds have been around for the last 15 years or so, and the returns of those have been very, very similar to whatever risk profile you've picked in them. So not everything that relates to capital markets relates to just the stock market. There is entire debt capital market that needs to be developed as well. There's a lot of private sector debt side that needs to be developed. And historically, you pick up countries in Europe, you pick up them in the US, markets have fundamentally been developed by investments made by very large pension funds, whether they are government or provincial or whichever, or even private sector. And here right now we have a situation where everyone is incredibly risk averse. You have the constant increase or the requirement on the return side to meet those liabilities 10 years, 15 years from now. And yet the willingness to kind of close the gap will certainly can be met by reform on one side, but needs to be also met by engaging the private sector, engaging third-party specialists who can actually come in and say, well, if we diversify the book in such a manner, we'll certainly get close to where we want to be by using capital market instruments. At the end of the day, this is a I would say in essence a market failure, right? That we are in a situation where the ballooning problem has gotten so large that now we're scrambling to fix it. But we have to find market-based solutions, because just increasing tax revenue or then reducing the size of government or reducing salaries, or these have major social implications as well. But if we engage with the private sector, find market-based solutions to these market failures, we certainly have a capital markets and a debt market that's begging for that kind of liquidity to be poured into it. And there's certainly investable ideas if one does their homework and one does their research well. So I think those are the kind of areas, or those are kind of thought process that we have to move towards if we're going to tackle this in any shape or form.
I think that literally that's the perfect response to the question. Thank you so much for that, Maheen. So very quickly, we're going to go to questions and comments from folks that wanted to speak, but I've invited Azaz Akhtar Dad, who has a lot of experience in the financial sector, but also in the public sector. Taimur will remember Azaz from the Punjab. Azaz worked in the Punjab government for quite a while on reform-related issues. Azaz, I've invited you. I know you can hear me, or I hope you can hear me. I've invited you to speak. I'd love it if you can join. And I've also invited Naseem Beg, and Naseem Beg is kind of an icon within the sort of financial sector. And Naseem Saab, maybe a very quick introduction and any comments or quick questions for Hashim or Taimur or Maheen. Naseem Saab.
Well, thank you, Mosharraf. Just as an introduction, I've been involved with the capital markets for many a year. I sort of set up the mutual fund, one of the first private sector ones for the Arif Habib group, which is now called MCB Arif Habib. I was also the primary author of the voluntary pension scheme that Maheen mentioned. So I've done a lot of work on the pension side. Some few quick things I'd like to sort of just observations. I'm not sure if when the NFC awards and the 18th Amendment, etc., were done, whether the pension liability was worked out and apportioned rightfully between the provinces, and whether the federal government sort of retain or has actually made itself responsible for the previous carryover. The second point I'd like to make is our savings rate of Pakistan is miserably low. We average between 10 and 12%, where if we take the rest of the subcontinent, it's at least twice that, their average. So, and on the one hand, we need this growth rate of 8% plus in our GDP. To get there, we need to be investing at least 25% of our GDP. If we save only 10 or 12%, then clearly there's a gap. So anything that is a forced saving will help us get there. Whether or not a defined contribution will help or not, yes, it will. But we just have to also recognize who retains the responsibility. Does the responsibility to transfer to the employee, and the employee then takes the investment decisions? Because whatever you invest in Pakistan, it will depend a lot on how the successive governments in Pakistan run the show, whether they run the economy into the ground or do whatever. And that is what impacts the investment returns for an average person. So, and I'm not suggesting that you don't have various asset classes and mixes of them, and the life cycle investment form, etc., which mitigates risk. But I will say this, that, and again, I think I heard probably Taimur mentioned the 10% contribution by the employee and 10% by the employer. Just give you just a quick arithmetic. If one works for 40 years and is putting away 10 plus 10, 20% per annum, and you just about match inflation by putting in government treasuries, or effectively actually floater rate government bonds that are the new thing now, and then you retire, and assuming you have to, you say that you live another 20 years, So the pool you've collected of 20% per annum and will now spend over the, so it's and I'm assuming zero inflation because you are earning the same return as inflation, then what you will have is 40% of your salary available to look after your retirement. Now, really, we need to have our numbers right. And it's easy enough to push the responsibility onto the employee, but there are serious issues. And will the government then step in and help out? Then you have the question of a widow or a grandparent and all those things that you bring out. I find that we have too many silos of people we are trying to look after as a nation. It ought to be just one simple thing, a universal basic income that takes care of a basic living standard for every Pakistani citizen. I think this pension to me is outdated. Let it be a voluntary pension for those who can earn and save. Most people don't have jobs. You've got 30 million kids out of school because they are helping parents shore up their income, albeit schooling is supposedly free. You've got malnutrition, God knows how many million kids who have stunted growth. So we really need to get out of a small segment of government employees, all the focus, the entire focus of this sector. Of course, I know the topic is government pensions, but really we need to look at a broader picture. So that's my bit.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that bit, Naseem Saab. I'm going to ask Taimur and Hashim and Maheen to respond to some of that. I think Taimur and Hashim in particular might have a take on that. But before we go back to our sort of featured speakers, Azaz, thank you for accepting the invite. So some quick thoughts and reflections from you on what you've heard today, and also any insights from your own experiences here in Pakistan and abroad, where you've spent most of your career. Azaz.
Thank you, Mosharraf, and thank you for having me here. Of course, salam to everybody, and Taimur and Hashim. We haven't spoken in a long time, but you guys are doing a great job in your current roles. In essence, I would say what Taimur and Hashim were alluding to was defined benefits in terms of pension schemes versus contribution-based pension schemes. So in many ways, you can go to a hybrid model to it in some form, or you can go, slowly switch off from defined benefits to contribution. And I think that's what will end up happening at some point. Looking at the amount of balloon from the liability side, it's massive for Pakistan government and government employees and the structure overall, and can't be taxed forever. So it needs to be coming from some way where these long end liabilities need to be figured out based on instruments which Maheen also mentioned. Some of them long-term instruments which does a appropriate asset liability management process using the capital markets. And I think some of the very good comments here are the fact that you have to go to private sector and you have to think about what are those instruments and how that capital markets need to be developed. Specifically, debt markets have to be developed to figure out your pension liabilities. And if you do it right for the government, I can tell you for sure the private sector will also jump on. I work in credit markets in London. I work for Morgan Stanley, but I have my heart in Pakistan all the time. I worked there with Taimur and Hashim in Punjab for 2.5 years. And I can tell you the reforms, which can happen once you get behind them. There's definitely things will turn around because I know the leadership is very much solid and they're very much focused on it. So I would basically say that in essence, once you have started to think about the reform, and a lot of people have written about the problem, taking it head on as a problem, as opposed to marginalizing it into wider society, is not the solution. You really have to tackle the pension problem for the government before you can tackle the wider problem of Social Security. That's one point I would make. In order to do that, I would say strongly that the government needs to take the private sector on board, specifically developing the capital markets around and financing vehicles for the long end liabilities you have. And it could be done based on secured financing vehicles, which can be formed based on infrastructure projects, based on other kinds of projects, which I don't want to go into too much. But there's a lot of work done, and there are a lot of ways you can do that. But what needs to happen is slowly move away from doing defined benefits and go towards contributions, and incentivizing, as Taimur has very clearly defined. You can get out of your government job, and those policies need to be put in place by government that you have an option out of the government job, and you can still take your pension with you, as opposed to waiting for another 25 years being a redundant employee just so that you can get it defined. So some policy making aligned with policy making for the private sector to come on board, for capital markets to get developed and properly do asset liability management, looking at the data, bringing in experts to help develop that market is going to be the way forward in my mind. I'll stop
Thank
here.
you. No, I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that, Azaz, and for accepting the invitation to speak. We're now 22 minutes from midnight, and we intend to turn this whole thing into a big pumpkin at the stroke of midnight. So, Uzair, I'm going to come to you. I also hear a rumor, Uzair, that you will be hosting an episode of Pakistonomy, a special episode in which you'll have a one-on-one with the Punjab Finance Minister, Mr. Hashim Bakht. Tell us a bit about that, and if you have any questions for Taimur or Maheen, assuming you'll save the questions for Hashim for later, please do share those.
Thanks, Mosharraf, and thanks for hosting this conversation, to Hashim and Taimur and Maheen for taking out the time. It's been wonderful, really insightful and educational. And I would love to have Hashim Saab on and have a longer discussion around the Punjab and priorities there from a public finance perspective. The question I had for both Hashim and Taimur Saab, I have two questions. One is, beyond pensions, what keeps you up at night when it comes to public finance issues and public finance reforms? Like, what's next in terms of your headspace, in terms of tackling a big issue that is facing your province or the broader economy as a whole from a public finance perspective? And number two, which is kind of related to what Hashim Saab, you were talking about at the very beginning of this discussion, we've talked a lot about and heard a lot about documenting the economy, people paying their fair share of taxes, etc. But the danda essentially has not worked. Pakistan has a large informal economy, large markets in Lahore, Peshawar, Karachi, etc. don't pay a fair share of taxes. So what are some creative ideas that you're toying with to basically rebuild a social contract where paying taxes is not considered something you do because you want to avoid the danda, but you do something because it is your civic duty and there are incentives associated towards doing that, versus the old sort of rhetoric of we need to document the economy and the traders need to get on board, which frankly does not happen given Pakistan's political economy. So thank you.
I've added a bunch of folks as speakers because they've been waiting for a long time to ask questions. But before I go to those questions, I just wanted to give, starting with Hashim Saab, an opportunity to kind of respond or react to some of the comments. So we'll go Hashim, Maheen, and then Taimur. Once we're done with this round, I'll take on questions from Farooq, Redwish, and one other, and Chaudhry Sajjad Hussain. I'll ask you guys to mute in the interim, and just first some responses or reactions, maybe to Uzair's question, to Azaz's presentation, or to Naseem Beg Saab. Starting with you, Hashim.
I think a lot of very pertinent comments have come from Beg Saab, Azaz. Always good to hear from him. Maheen was exceptional, and Uzair also. Let me just first come to the fact that a few of our speakers here are from the capital markets, and they've talked about the need for our capital markets to evolve. And frankly, I couldn't agree more. Our banks here, even in Pakistan, I mean, I myself was associated with the financial sector for 10 years. I used to work for Citibank. In fact, I used to also look after the public sector side of Citibank dealing with the government of Pakistan, be it their fundraising activities within Pakistan or internationally, their uh, international bond issuances. And I really feel that, you know, the financial sector here really needs to branch out. It really needs to start catering to the private sector. We are lending to the sovereign. The banks have been lending to the sovereign and are very comfortable in not looking and expanding. And I really feel that, how it's been mentioned, capital markets के अंदर हुकूमत को ये banks के साथ मिलके finally we'll have to give them this sort of an initial comfort. और ये हुआ भी है. ये recent times के अंदर कोविड के अंदर हमने I mean these are small nudge factors but they are also coming into play. जिस तरह एक स्कीम हमने शुरू की है एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेशन के लिए कि बैंक्स एसएमई को लेंड करते हैं, माइक्रो फाइनेंस में लेंड करते हैं, बट ट्रेडिशनल कमर्शियल बैंक्स अभी रिलक्टेंट थे. तो हमने फर्स्ट लॉस गारंटी इंट्रोड्यूस कराना शुरू की है. आप लोग लेंड करें, हुकूमत उसको सपोर्ट करेगी. I'm going slightly off track here, off tangent here, but it's very important to realize that liquidity in this entire economy is also very important, and government should not be crowding out space. In fact, in order to make the financial sector comfortable, government should now be providing that first loss guarantees, and I'm actually seeing the needle move in this aspect. So it'll be very good अगर ये चीज further augment होती है, private sector इसमें loans ले सकता है, SME को loans मिलते हैं, mortgage to GDP रेशो पाकिस्तान की इम्प्रूव करती है. तो इन सारी चीज़ों के लिए हम पंजाब में अपनी हुकूमत अपनी इनिशिएटिव्स को फर्स्ट लॉस बेसिस पे सपोर्ट भी कर रहे हैं. एंड आई विल बी हैप्पी टू कनेक्ट विद various financial experts who've already spoken on this forum to help further facilitate and move ahead with this sort of trajectory. मैं अब उज़ैर की चीज़ को ज़रा एड्रेस करूँगा. We'll be having a detailed session ourselves and is very well versed as far as what Punjab is doing. तो यहाँ बात की गई कि हम लोगों को क्या ऐसी चीज़ करने की ज़रूरत है जिससे टैक्स कल्चर चेंज हो और थोड़ा टिपिकल कह देना कि यार टैक्स बेस की एक्सपेंशन अच्छी चीज़ है. इसके अलावा दो चीज़ें हैं which I feel in my experience so far which have started yielding results. One is to incentivize the end payer. जीएसटी टैक्सेशन में एंड तो ये कंज्यूमर पे ही होता है, आम सिटीजन दे रहा होता है, ये इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेशन वाला. उसको जब स्लैब्स डिफरेंट नजर आती हैं कि अगर मैं कार्ड ई पे, अब तो हमने क्यूआर कोड को भी सैंक्शन कर दिया है कि इन चीजों के जरिए अगर आप पे करते हैं तो आपका टैक्स स्लैब डिफरेंट होगा. So that we have seen actually change in behavior of the customer wanting to go ahead, and they have actually forced or nudged the restaurants in this case or beauty parlors in this case is to actually go for documentation of economy. कच्ची रसीदें कम हो गई हैं इन सेक्टर्स के अंदर क्योंकि वो बेनिफिट कर रहे हैं इस चीज से. दूसरी चीज जो है which we are working towards, and that is the concept of benefit taxation. जो थर्ड टियर ऑफ गवर्नमेंट है, लोकल गवर्नमेंट की टैक्सेशन, अगर आपकी यू विल बी मोर रिसेप्टिव टू पेइंग अ टैक्स. अगर मैं आपकी स्ट्रीट लाइट को चेंज कर दूं उसके साथ, अगर मैं आपका पॉट होल चेंज कर दूं, समथिंग विच इज टेंजिबल फॉर विच यू कैन सी द बेनिफिट एक्चुअली टेकिंग प्लेस. तो हमारा ज्यादा फोकस इस साल का है कि हमने जो टैक्सेशन जिनका इमीडिएट बेनिफिट नजर आता है सिटीजन को, उसकी तरफ रुझान बढ़ाना है, उन चीजों को इम्प्रूव करना है, उसमें बेहतरी लेके आनी है ताकि दे कैन एक्चुअली सी दैट मनी और देयर टैक्स मनी बीइंग स्पेंट on their immediate environment, immediate neighborhood. So that is one of our main focuses for this year.
That fantastic. Thank you for that, Hashim Saab. Taimur Saab, Maheen Saiba, either of you want to jump in and respond to some of the points that were made by Uzair, by Azaz, or by Naseem Saab?
Yeah, I'm sorry I lost Hashim, but I imagine that we're doing fairly similar things on taxation. उस पे मैं 2 सेकंड बात करना चाह रहा था. I think this will resonate, but just to just to sort of create the necessary amount of empirical evidence कि indeed innovation works. I think उज़ैर का सवाल बिल्कुल सही था कि कुछ out of the box thinking करनी है कि जो हमें पाकिस्तान as a federation, meaning not just the federal government but all the federating units, right? कि हमें वो revenue sources चाहिए कि हम यहाँ पे वो इन्वेस्टमेंट कर सके कि जिससे इकोनॉमी भी उठे और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर भी उठे और सर्विस डिलीवरी भी उठे. तो आवर एक्सपीरियंस हैज आल्सो बीन वेरी सिमिलर कि जब आप वो इनोवेशन लाते हैं और आप लोगों को वो टैक्सेशन का बेनिफिट दिखाते हैं तो इट एक्चुअली क्रिएट्स द वर्चुअस साइकिल कि टैक्स लोगों को देना आसान हो जाता है. मेरे ख्याल में बाय द वे दुनिया में शायद कोई भी मुल्क नहीं है जहां पे लोग खुशी से टैक्स देते हैं. If we want to get to that end point, I think that may be too aspirational. मैंने कम से कम कोई बंदा भी नहीं देखा जो कि खुश होता है कि मैं बड़ी खुशी से ये टैक्स बन रहा है ये मैं दे रहा हूँ. That's human instinct. आप जो पैसा कमाते हैं आप अपने पास रखना चाहते हैं. लेकिन ये जरूर है कि in many countries that you live you feel कि जो आप टैक्स देते हैं कि उसका बेनिफिट आपको मिलता है. We found कि जहां पे हमने इनोवेटिव टैक्स ब्रेक्स दिए उसका फायदा पड़ा. हमने लास्ट ईयर प्राइम मिनिस्टर के कंस्ट्रक्शन इनिशिएटिव के लिए प्रॉपर्टी परचेजेस पे टैक्सेस 7% से 2% को कम किए एंड इंटरेस्टिंगली हमारा रेवेन्यू एक्चुअली बढ़ा. हमने खैबर पख्तूनख्वा रेवेन्यू अथॉरिटी में कोई 30 टैक्सेस जो है वो कम किए. उस टाइप की सेल्स टैक्स ऑन सर्विसेज पे हाशिम ने भी बात की. एंड ओवर द लास्ट 2 years खैबर पख्तूनख्वा रेवेन्यू अथॉरिटीज रेवेन्यू हैज मोर देन डबल्ड. हमने जो है अर्बन प्रॉपर्टी टैक्स के रेट्स पे अर्ली पेमेंट पे डिस्काउंट ऑफर किया. And over the last year, although the base was small, urban property tax double हुई और हम भी वही काम कर रहे हैं कि we are now trying to link that urban property tax payment to local investment. हमने restaurants पे जो एक रेस्टोरेंट इनवॉइस मॉनिटरिंग सिस्टम लगाते हैं उनको इंसेंटिव दिया कि वो रेस्टोरेंट्स 8% के बजाय 5% टैक्स collect करें. And I recently published the list of restaurants जो कि उस स्कीम में registered है. And immediately after I started getting both feedback from people trying to basically amplify the voice that is saying कि ये restaurants जाने वाले हैं. And I also started getting feedback from restaurants. कोई 100 restaurants की list दी थी saying कि जी हम भी इस पे हैं या आना चाहते हैं और हमारा नाम नहीं है हमारा नाम भी डालें. So you want to create these virtuous cycles उससे हमारा टैक्स जो है वो मतलब कोई साल में डबल नहीं होगा लेकिन I think कि with a little bit of continuity फर्क बहुत पड़ेगा. And this year I think all of the tax authorities in the provinces have done well. I think Punjab has shown greater growth than we have. We showed greater growth last year. So I know Hashim does not fail to remind me that Punjab has shown slightly greater growth than we have. And I think kudos to him and a little bit of healthy competition is good. But I think कि ये चीज भी साबित करती है and I know Mosharraf you agree with this कि सूबे जो हैं हमारे वो इस रेवेन्यू कलेक्शन में अपना रोल प्ले भी कर रहे हैं. And I think जब हम साथ में काम करेंगे तो we'll be able to do a better job, learn from each other, have healthy competition और फायदा पूरे पाकिस्तान को होगा.
जी बिल्कुल. I mean that is ultimately the best payoff is when Pakistan benefits. Maheen, did you want to just quickly sort of add something, and then I'm going to go to the list of speakers that we have with questions, and I'm going to ask them to be very short, but starting Maheen, you go
Okay.
first.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think capital markets की काफी बात की है लोगों ने and banking sector की भी बात की है हाशिम साहब ने. इसमें देखिए, let's be clear, banking sector does not take significant risk. The lending is to very few institutions or corporates or then to the government. Capital markets are slightly better but very underdeveloped. So आपने बात की on the guarantee side, which is interesting because that's exactly the business that InfraZamin is in. Now, the trick here will be that you don't underwrite all the risk. You have to underwrite just enough risk so that the local participation in the market is tempted in. And I think there's a very fine line in managing that. And I think it's important to keep the private sector very engaged, especially when we talk about issuing credit guarantees against debt capital market structures. So I think that the real change or the catalyst comes when just enough risk is underwritten against debt market instruments that come from the private sector to mobilize local savings in, whether they come from pension schemes or whether they come from other government institutions or whether they come from even the private sector pension participants or the private sector institutional money that can come into such things. So I think it's important to recognize the value that capital markets can bring and how we need to break this constant cycle of not wanting to bear risk through guarantee structures. So that's just my own thing in terms of how to kind of kickstart the entire local mobilization of local currency to fund the infrastructure or the reforms or even the pension returns that we need to earn.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maheen. Okay. Now I have read something, redwish.com, and then Chaudhry. Just hold on one second. Then we have Chaudhry Sajjad, and then we have Farooq. So these three speakers, bhaiyon, really sincere request. 30 seconds, just because we want to finish at midnight, and we've had these fantastic speakers. 30 seconds, starting with redwish.com.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम. Redwish, एक अहमर मुराद, aka Redwish. Mosharraf, thank you for holding the session. Great topic. Thank you, Taimur Saab and Hashim Saab, for all the work that you're doing and your willingness to take on these difficult decisions. I think that's what we love to see from you guys, and please stay the course. My question is, Taimur Saab, you mentioned transitioning maybe over time from defined benefit to defined contribution model, and also the changes to the pension rules that took away those 14 layers to a more simple hierarchy. What has been the response to that, and what type of change management is it going to take? वो ये जो बेवाओं को लूट लिया, यतीमों को बर्बाद कर दिया, पेन डाउन हड़ताल और धरने, और ये you're fundamentally changing it from here is your entitlement to more like a provident fund. Ki yaar, this is what your contribution earns, so that's all you're going to be able to get. That's going to require a lot of change management and expectations management. So wanted to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Great, thank you, Emmer. Chaudhry Sajjad, you're next.
Assalamu alaikum, Mosharraf bhai. Thank you so much for giving me a chance. और congratulations कि आप हमेशा जो स्पेस बनाते हैं उसमें बड़ी फ्रूटफुल होती हैं. मैं एक चीज यहाँ पे रिक्वेस्ट करना चाहता हूँ, हैविंग चांस कि हाशिम भी हैं और तैमूर भी हैं. चिप मेकिंग का 850 बिलियन यूएस डॉलर का एक प्रोजेक्ट लग रहा है साउथ कोरिया में, और वहाँ पे 50 to 60,000 जो लोग हैं वो चाहिए, जो ट्रेनी होते हैं. जो हमारी बात हुई है यहाँ पे पाकिस्तान के लिए 2000 लोग हमने ऑलरेडी बढ़ाए थे अपना कोटा जब रहीम हयात कुरैशी थे यहाँ पे. तो जो ब्यूरोक्रेटिक यहाँ प्रॉब्लम आती है, यू नो बेटर देन मी, बलोच साहबा हैं यहाँ पे एम्बेसडर, तो मेरी इन दो भाइयों से रिक्वेस्ट है कि प्लीज हमें वहां से कुछ ऐसी कमिटमेंट्स बना के गवर्नमेंट लेवल पे अगर भिजवाते हैं. तो मैं यहाँ क्योंकि बिजनेस काउंसिल का मेंबर भी हूँ साउथ कोरिया में, यहाँ मेरी एक इंडस्ट्री है, रिसाइकलिंग प्लांट है, तो गवर्नमेंट जो है उनके पास इस वक्त लेबर शॉर्टेज है, दे नीड द पीपल एंड दे आर वेरी हैप्पी विद पाकिस्तानीज जो यहाँ पे हमारे 12,000 लोग काम करते हैं. तो प्लीज वहां से हमें हेल्प आउट करें ताकि हम पाकिस्तान के लिए 50 to 60,000 कोटा जो है वो बना सकते हैं मजीद. विद इन 1 year दे नीड द पीपल. और मुशर्रफ भाई मैं शायद थोड़ा 1-2 सेकंड और ले लूं, इतना ज्यादा प्रेशर है गवर्नमेंट के ऊपर कि सैमसंग के भाई साहब जो अंदर हैं, हमारी जो इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट की एक मीटिंग हुई है उसमें गवर्नमेंट के साथ एक मीटिंग हुई कि प्लीज उनको बाहर निकालें. तो प्लीज इस पे कुछ करें. थैंक यू.
A great opportunity for government on that front. Mumtaz Baloch, one of our finest foreign service officers, is our representative to Seoul, and I will definitely follow up with both Taimur and Hashim and others to follow up on that. Thank you for bringing that up. Farooq Saab, you're next.
हाँ जी, फॉर अ चेंज लेट मी जस्ट स्पीक इन उर्दू सो मोस्ट पीपल कैन बेनिफिट. अच्छा, मैं उर्दू में कोशिश करता हूँ सवाल पूछने की. मेरा एक ये है कि जो मेरी कॉमन मैन के एंगल से मैं इसको थोड़ा लेना चाहता हूँ, बिकॉज वी आर यूजिंग अ लॉट टू मेनी फाइनेंस जार्गन्स. जो लॉस मेकिंग इंटरप्राइजेज हैं, जो हमारा मेजोरिटी पैसा खा जाती हैं इन टर्म्स ऑफ हंड्रेड्स ऑफ बिलियंस ऑफ रुपीस, उनका हमारे पास क्या लॉन्ग टर्म सोल्यूशन है? बिकॉज इंस्टेड ऑफ कटिंग डाउन ऑन थिंग्स, आई बिलीव इन ग्रोइंग थिंग्स. तो हम इसको अगर प्राइवेट की तरफ अगर ले जाएं तो दैट शुड हेल्प अस अ लॉट. और दूसरा मेरा ये है कि आफ्टर 2010 में 18th अमेंडमेंट जब पास हुई थी, उसके बाद ये था कि जी प्रोविंसेस को एम्पावर किया जाएगा और फेडरल को छोटा किया जाएगा. हुआ ये कि फेडरल भी बड़ा होता गया और प्रोविंस भी बढ़ेगी. अभी भी हायरिंग नहीं रुकी. तो कोई प्लान है कि फेडरल को हम छोटा करें फ्रॉम द 50 मिनिस्ट्रीज, और मिनिस्ट्रियों के नाम चेंज हो गए, वो वहीं की वहीं हैं, एंड नथिंग मच इज हैपनिंग ऑन दैट फ्रंट. मैं कुछ देख रहा तो टू रिड्यूस द नंबर ऑफ स्टाफ जो पब्लिक सेक्टर में इस वक्त हैं, बिकॉज प्रोविंसेस भी हायर कर रहे हैं, पब्लिक भी हायर कर रही है. तीसरा मेरा ये है कि जो पेंशन फंड है, उसमें पेंशन फंड है, उसमें मेजर पैसा एक चला जाता है. हमारी जो मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ डिफेंस की आर्म फोर्सेस हैं, वो भी सिविल में से ले रही हैं पैसा, और उनकी रिटायरमेंट एज सिपाही की जो है वो 30, 35, 40 साल होती है, और जो ऑफिसर होता है वो भी 45 साल से लेकर 80 साल तक पेंशन लेता है. तो जो हमारी सिविल सर्विसेज के जो पेंशन है, उसका 50% से ज्यादा कंट्रीब्यूशन तो आर्म फोर्सेज को चला जाता है. उसको कैसे आप लोग सॉल्व करेंगे, या उनको कैसे रिटायरमेंट की तरफ लेके जाएंगे?
Thank you, Farooq Saab. Thanks for those questions. We're gonna take one more. I think we have Tayyib, who's lined up. Tayyib Saab, you have 20 seconds. Bismillah.
Yeah, thank you, Sheriff. So just quickly comment. I don't have a question as such. In pension, what my suggestion would be to, instead of having a fund where contribution and everything, just pay it out in salaries and give them incentive to save. So that will have it's sort of like a two-sided advantage where, you know, the savings will go up as well. Comparative purposes, if you ever want to look at, you can look at the Canadian RRSP system as it's known. So it's a registered retirement savings plan.
Arsalan and then Adi. We have Arsalan and then Adi, and then we'll close it out. Arsalan.
जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. मेरे दो सवालात हैं असल में. पहला तो ये कि मैं असल में जर्मनी में रहता हूँ, तो यहाँ पे एक सिस्टम ये है कि आप बेशक प्राइवेट एम्प्लॉई हैं या फिर आप गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉई हैं, तो आपका इधर एक नेशनल पेंशन फंड टाइप की चीज़ होती है, वहाँ पे आप पैसे देते रहते हैं, और अगर आप अर्ली रिटायरमेंट लेते हैं तो आपको कम पैसे पेंशन के तौर पे मिलते हैं, और अगर आप पूरा अपना काम करते हैं, जिस तरह यहाँ पे एज पेंशन रिटायरमेंट की एज तकरीबन 67.5 है इस वक्त, तो आप 67.5 तक अगर काम करते हैं अपनी ईयर्स तक, तो फिर आपको पूरी पेंशन मिलती है, जो भी, क्योंकि जितनी आपने कंट्रीब्यूशन की होती है तो उसी हिसाब से आपको पेंशन मिलती है. फॉर एग्जांपल, अगर आपकी 10 लाख रुपए तनख्वाह है, तो अगर आप उसके हिसाब से जो भी परसेंटेज देते हैं, तो आपकी पेंशन भी उसी हिसाब से तय होगी. तो मेरा एक सवाल ये कि हम इस साइड पे क्यों नहीं जाते, हम क्यों मतलब टिपिकल उसी अभी तक उस पे चल रहे हैं कि आपकी सिर्फ गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉयज के पास पेंशन होगी, क्योंकि प्राइवेट जो लोग हैं, जो लोग प्राइवेट कंपनीज में काम कर रहे हैं, उन बेचारों को तो कुछ भी नहीं मिलता है, जो आम एम्प्लॉई है. तो पहले ये सवाल मेरा ये था, और दूसरा ये था कि जिस तरह जर्मनी में, और जिस तरह भी एक चौधरी सज्जाद थे, उन्होंने बताया कि साउथ कोरिया में जब वर्कर्स की शॉर्टेज है, इसी तरह जर्मनी में भी स्किल्ड वर्कर्स की शॉर्टेज है. तो मतलब हम लोग बाकायदा इन कंट्रीज को क्यों नहीं हम लोग टारगेट कर रहे, और हम बाकायदा, क्योंकि मैंने पिछले साल एक इनिशिएटिव देखा था नस्ट के अंदर, मेरे ख्याल से एक इंस्टीट्यूट था, वो कर रहा था, लेकिन अभी तक मतलब मैंने उस तरीके से लोगों को आते हुए नहीं देखा यहाँ पे एज अ वर्कर.
Got it, Arsalan. Great question. Thank you. Last question going to Adi. आप unmute करेंगे.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mosharraf sir, for giving me an opportunity. I've got one question. I've got one suggestion. Question is how we are planning to net the huge budget we have for the taxes this year, because we have, there is, the government is planning unprecedented increase in the taxes. So what are the new avenues which we are targeting in order to increase our tax budget, which we are set it, which is quite significant as we compare for the last year. Second suggestion is, I think a lot of problems could be solved in terms of public-private partnership. So I would like to know why the government, if the government is working toward having public-private partnerships so that a lot of infrastructure projects can be shared among private sector, and the private sector can play more part in order to groom small medium enterprises, which are the backbone of the economy. Thank you very much, sir.
Great questions. Thank you, Eddie, and thank you to everyone. I see and recognize Vasif, Hamza, and there was at least one other questioner, and I'm just going to have to beg for your forgiveness because phenomenally 2 घंटे से ऊपर जो है तैमूर और माहीन और हाशिम साहब तीनों जो हैं वो हमारे साथ थे. तो in fairness to them, I want us to wrap up quickly. Rather than going to the two ministers first, we're going to begin with Maheen. Maheen, there was a bunch of questions there. Are there any that you feel that you have an answer to or that you want to comment on? Then we'll go to Taimur, and we're going to end with the largest province of the country, that is the Punjab. So Hashim Saab, you'll have the last word. Maheen, Rahman.
Okay, so number of questions. I think I'll just take the last one, which was related to PPP, which I completely endorse. I think there is already quite a bit of work that Sindh has actually done on the PPP side, and I would like to see that picked up as well by Punjab as well as KPK. I think that is your main avenue in which the private sector can actually be involved and make that significant difference, not just in large scale infrastructure projects, but also in the SME segment or also in the startup segment in many cases as well. So absolutely, I think that is a area that needs to be further developed, and I would really like to see that come through more in terms of the kind of private sector participants that are engaged in PPP projects. Thanks, Mosharraf.
Taimur Saab, over to you. Thank you, Maheen. I'll thank you more effusively in just a moment. But Taimur, the floor is yours.
Is there anything that you would particularly like me to take, Mosharraf? There are a lot of questions over there.
Well, I always think that overseas Pakistanis get a bad rap, especially from people like me. So I think the fact that we had two folks, one from Germany, one from South Korea, that are, rather than asking for something for themselves, they're saying, hey, man, these countries have a labor shortage. Why don't you send more people? I know that's not the topic today, but if I could get you and Hashim to just acknowledge that, and if you could ask your staff to make a note and maybe follow up, I think it'll just be a great signal to these fantastic overseas Pakistanis that care so much.
जी, I think बिल्कुल करना चाहिए, and I think के जो overseas Pakistanis की contribution है and their trust in the Prime Minister, जो कि हमारे रोशन digital accounts में जो record remittances आ रही हैं, उससे जाहिर है, I think the role that they play cannot be overstated. And that's why मेरे ख्याल में वो टाइम आ गया है कि उनको वोट का हक भी दें और उनकी कॉन्फिडेंस और उनकी लिंकेजेस पाकिस्तान के साथ दोबारा बिल्ड करें. क्या और ओवरसीज जो है वो वर्कर्स को जाना चाहिए? बिल्कुल जाना चाहिए. क्या जर्मनी और कोरिया जाना चाहिए? जी बिल्कुल जाना चाहिए. Let's understand though कि generally Pakistan has a huge diaspora, obviously primarily in the Middle East, शायद overrepresented from KP, लेकिन तकरीबन सारे पाकिस्तान से लोग बाहर जाते हैं. दो कमेंट्स इस पे. जब आप जर्मनी में बैठे हो या कोरिया में बैठे हो, आपको लगता होगा कि क्यों when we put in a request तो ज्यादा जल्दी एक्शन क्यों नहीं लिया जाता. And amongst other things, one of the reasons is कि इतनी ज्यादा प्रायोरिटीज होती है कि आपको पिक एंड चूज करना पड़ता है. आज हम पेंशन्स पे बात कर रहे थे. यू सी टेक्निकल सॉल्यूशंस टू वन साइड, दिस इज अ प्रॉब्लम. और इसमें एक सवाल भी आया था कि आपको पॉलिटिकली भी देखना पड़ता है, इसकी एपेटाइट भी बिल्ड करनी पड़ती है. और एक बीच में सवाल था, आई थिंक माशाल्लाह अभी तक जितना भी किया है ओवरऑल इम्पैक्ट पॉजिटिव ही आया है, बिकॉज तरीके से किया है, सही नियत से किया है, एक्सप्लेन सही किया है. एंड सो आई थिंक दैट वी एक्सपेक्ट एंड थिंक के लोग जो है वो इन चीजों को नहीं समझते. अगर आप थोड़ा सा प्रेशर एब्जॉर्ब करें और थोड़ी सी बोल्डनेस दिखाएं तो ये चीजें हो सकती हैं. बट व्हाट दैट टिपिकली मीन्स, पाकिस्तान के बाद प्रॉब्लम्स इतने कॉम्प्लेक्स हैं कि देयर आर सो मेनी थिंग्स दैट यू वुड लाइक टू डू, लेकिन थोड़ा सा आपको 80-20 होना पड़ता है. एक पहली चीज. दूसरी चीज, I feel that if there is one thing that we should do as we actually send more workers abroad, is to also think of how we can send and upskill more workers, और जो हमारी proportion है labor की unskilled और skilled labor की, वो change करें. But I think that's a topic for another night. I think fantastic discussion, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Mosharraf, and thank you both to Hashim and Maheen, as well as to all the people who listened and contributed.
Hashim Saab, I promised that you'd get the last word. Thank you, Taimur. Thank you, Maheen. Thanks especially to the Tabadlab team that behind the scenes is enabling all of this to take place. They're really the actual stars here. I just get to learn from fantastic folks like the three of you, and I'm grateful that you guys made time. Hashim Saab, reflections on the conversation, specific responses to questions and comments that were raised, and a goodbye note and a Khudafis note from you before we end off tonight.
It has been a fascinating experience, I must say, and the quality of questions, the quality of comments which were made by speakers who joined in were fascinating. I've started taking notes, and some of the key things which I want to just end on. One thing which has kept Pakistan afloat is our expats. Their contribution. You see, when we go into a growth spurt, it is only because we start importing and the trade balance kind of tilts and our exports are not catching up in that way. And then we go back into that spiral again and again, into that typical spiral where we become this, then we try and cool down the economy, and then again the slowdown starts. So economy has to be supported by exports, and the human capital which we have there, the remittances which are coming in. But the world is now changing. The world is now looking for skilled labor. As जैसे सजाद साहब ने बात की, अब वो सेमीकंडक्टर इंडस्ट्री के लिए ढूंढ रहे हैं. हमारा यहाँ पे जो प्रोड्यूस आ रहा है ह्यूमन रिसोर्स का, उसको स्किल की तरफ अब पहली बारी लेके जाया जा रहा है. स्किल सिखाना, वोकेशनल ट्रेनिंग was never need based in Pakistan. एक काम करें जी, 10,000 आप टेलर प्रोड्यूस करते हैं. भाई किसी ने डिमांड किया है टेलर को दुनिया में? कभी ये क्यों नहीं सोचा जाता कि यहाँ पे दोहा में फुटबॉल होने लगी है, स्टेडियम्स बनने हैं स्टेट ऑफ द आर्ट, आप अपनी मेसनरी को उस मटेरियल के लिए ट्रेन करें, ग्लोबल डिमांड्स को देखें कहाँ से जनरेट होने वाली हैं, अगले बड़े इवेंट्स, ट्रेड फेयर्स, चीजें कहाँ से हो रही हैं, लेटेस्ट इक्विपमेंट क्या यूज हो रहा है, कंस्ट्रक्शन मटेरियल क्या यूज हो रहा है, आप इन चीजों के अंदर उनको ट्रेन करें और ताकि आपकी एक डिमांड हो. दुनिया में स्किल्ड लेबर की डिमांड आ रही है, आहिस्ता आहिस्ता अनस्किल्ड की कम होती जा रही है. पहली बारी हुआ है कि पिछले 3 साल से मैं देख रहा हूँ आहिस्ता आहिस्ता, नाउ इट इज बीइंग डिमांड ड्रिवन. व्हेन पीपल कम टू मी, फॉर एग्जांपल द टेफ्टा ऑफ पंजाब, कि जी हमने यहाँ इंस्टीट्यूशन खोलना है, पहले पूछते हैं हम उनसे कि भाई क्या पढ़ाने लगे हो और क्यों पढ़ाने लगे हो, उसकी डिमांड कहाँ से जनरेट हुई. वजीराबाद में सर्जिकल इक्विपमेंट के लिए लोग कम पढ़ रहे हैं, दुनिया में नर्सेस की शॉर्टेजेस हो रही है. तो वी आर नाउ फोकसिंग ऑन those particular areas in which you have either domestic demand or there's an international shortage. So that one thing which we have in abundance, which we need to think of it as one of our best exports, and that is our human capital. So yes, there is a focus on it, and hats off to the Pakistanis living everywhere in the world for their patriotism. They have really kept Pakistan afloat. If that is one thing which has kept Pakistan, it is these expats. तो एक मैंने ये जरूर इस वक्त बात करनी थी. दूसरा, स्टेट ओन एंटिटीज की बात हुई. आई थिंक गवर्नमेंट ने ओवर टाइम बहुत ज्यादा अपने आप को ओवर स्ट्रेच कर लिया है. गवर्नमेंट इज नॉट इन द बिजनेस ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस, स्पेशली व्हेन योर ट्रैक रिकॉर्ड हैज प्रूवन कि बहुत सारी चीजों में हमारा वो यूनियंस हो जाती हैं, चीजें हो जाती हैं. वी स्टार्ट टेकिंग अ लेस बिजनेस सेंट्रिक अप्रोच बट अ मोर सोशल सेंट्रिक अप्रोच टू businesses which should be run like proper businesses. So, मेरे ख्याल से privatization will play a very important role. We need to, in certain cases, cut our losses. Even if the valuations are not there, at least future perpetual losses तो कम होंगे आपके, and they're bleeding us dry. I think that one thing needs to stop. Last thing I want to talk about is the PPP. There is no other way we can ensure कि हम less developed areas में पहुंचे अगर हम PPP को नहीं अपनाते. Public-private partnerships are the key to the future. Public spending याद रखिएगा वहां करनी होती है जहां पे private spending ना हो रही हो. For cities which get developed, for urban centers like Lahore, यहाँ पे अब प्राइवेट एपेटाइट आ गई है. अब हमें पब्लिक फंड्स का रुख मोड़ना है, मुंह मोड़ना है ऐसी जगहों पे इंटरमीडिएट सिटीज को डेवलप करने के लिए. और वो तभी कर पाएंगे जब इस इतने बड़े शहर की रिक्वायरमेंट्स को हम थ्रू अ प्राइवेट पब्लिक पार्टनरशिप फिल करना शुरू करें. एंड देयर आर इमेंस अपॉर्चुनिटीज. आई थिंक द एनवायरनमेंट is now getting conducive for people to take initiatives. We have a very decent pipeline of almost 300 billion of various assets where we can actually go ahead and initiatives where we can actually do public-private partnerships. Provinces cash poor तो हो गए but अभी भी asset rich हैं. We have very good assets, especially of land, and we, if leveraged properly in a conducive environment and financing is raised on the back of the government, I feel PPP will be the real game changer, which will change and transform our development requirements, our urban development requirements. So yes, but उसके लिए एक environment का conducive होना जरूरी है. And I think in terms of the needle moving, इस पे अब चीजें शुरू हो गई हैं. In the end, I would just like to say that be it myself, my counterpart in KPK, our government overall, there is a significant cognizance which has been undertaken कि हर चीज के अंदर हमने change लेके आना है. Most of the impact which you will see of our government's actions will actually be longer term initiatives. तो ये shorter term myopic focus आपको हमारी तरफ से, I do not see a typical political focus कि जी इसको 1 साल में कर लो, इसको 2 में कर लो, बस इन्हीं पे focus करो, strategic systemic issues को address ना करें. So on that note, I would just like to assure the people who are listening in that we will work on these chronic systemic issues which we have inherited, and inshallah the needle will move on this, where there will be certain things will require just a gentle nudge, certain would require actually new shaking up of the system, but we will be doing it. So we have taken it upon ourselves कि हमने ये status quo को हर लिहाज से change करना है, because the trajectory, the way it is right now, it is not very promising. It needs structural fixes, and the resolve is very much there. So thank you for having me online tonight.
Minister Hashim Bakht, Minister Taimur Jhagra, and Maheen Rahman, CEO of InfraZamin. It's been a great pleasure to listen to you, and a great privilege to have you join and engage in this conversation. It is a very dry topic, but the fact that for most of the evening we were running strong at well over 150 listeners means that people really want to learn about serious issues. People want to engage with serious issues. People don't mind Angrezi Urdu, and a lot of the noise on social media is not reflective of the sobriety and the seriousness of Pakistanis. So most of all, I thank people for tuning in and listening, and contributing to the effort and acknowledging it. It's been a great privilege and pleasure, and I'm once again grateful to the 3 speakers and everybody else who joined us. And I'm sorry we didn't get to every person who wanted to ask a question, but we did get to most. So Jazakallah khair. Everyone have a good night, and thanks once again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.